Eleanor Whitmore did not flinch when Margaret's fingers closed around her wrist at the dinner table. She did not cry out. She did not pull away. She simply sat still, 22 faces turning toward her in the candlelight as the glove was stripped from her arm and the burn scars were laid bare before every powerful family in Virginia. The room went silent. Her husband had not yet moved. And in that silence, Eleanor made a decision that would change everything. If you want to know what she did next, subscribe to our channel, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment. Tell us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far Eleanor's story has traveled. The coach rolled through the iron gates of Caldwell Manor on a Tuesday morning in July, 1816, and Eleanor Whitmore did not look out the window. She had made that decision somewhere around the last mile of road, when the oak trees grew tall enough to block the sky and the air turned close and green and heavy with Virginia heat. Looking out the window would have meant seeing it all at once: the house, the land, the life she was stepping into, and Eleanor had learned long ago that the best way to survive something you cannot escape is to take it piece by piece. So she sat straight-backed on the leather seat, her hands folded in her lap, her ivory gloves buttoned at the wrist. She breathed. She did not look. The coach stopped. The door opened. She stepped out, and then she had no choice but to see it. Caldwell Manor was larger than she had imagined. 3 stories of pale Virginia brick, flanked by white columns that had probably impressed every person who'd ever driven up that road. The ground stretched wide in every direction: formal gardens to the left, working fields beyond them, a row of oak trees lining the front drive that must have been 100 years old at least. It was the kind of place built by men who intended to be remembered. Eleanor took one breath of the July morning air, hot and thick and smelling faintly of boxwood hedges, and reminded herself why she was here. Not for love. She had set that notion aside years ago, along with a great many other things a woman of her age and situation could not reasonably afford to carry. She was here because Judge Whitmore, her father, had called in a favor with Nathaniel Caldwell's solicitor. She was here because at 27, she was considered nearly past the age where a respectable marriage was possible. She was here because a quiet life on a Virginia estate, managed by a man who needed a sensible wife and not a romantic one, was considerably better than the alternative she'd been facing. She was not naive about what this was. Neither, she suspected, was Nathaniel Caldwell. The front door of the manor opened before she reached the steps, and a woman appeared at the top of them, not a servant. Eleanor could tell immediately by the way she stood. Chin up, shoulders squared. The particular stillness of someone who has decided before you even open your mouth that they already know everything they need to know about you. She was young, perhaps 24 or 25, with dark hair pinned severely, and eyes the color of good Virginia clay, a brownish gray that gave nothing away. She wore black, though not fresh morning black, the kind that has been worn so many times it has started to look like a permanent state. "Miss Whitmore," she said. Not coldly either. "Just precisely." "Yes," Eleanor said. She climbed the last step and offered her hand. "You must be Miss Margaret Caldwell. It's a pleasure to meet you." Margaret looked at the offered hand for one beat, longer than was strictly polite, before she took it. Her grip was firm, businesslike. "My brother sends his apologies. He was needed at the South Field this morning. He'll be in for supper." "Of course," Eleanor said. "I understand completely. I'll show you to your rooms." It was not an invitation. Margaret Caldwell had already turned and walked back through the door, and Eleanor followed, because there was nothing else to do. The room they gave her was pleasant enough. High ceilings, good light from the east-facing windows, a writing desk positioned near the door to the adjoining sitting room. The bed had been made up with fresh linens that smelled of lavender, and something else, something Eleanor couldn't quite identify at first, something that tugged at the back of her mind before she placed it. Rosewater, very faint, very deliberate. She stood in the middle of the room for a moment and understood without being told that this had been someone else's room before it was hers. She did not say anything about it. She merely asked the girl who was carrying in her trunk where she might find hot water for washing, thanked her when she was told, and began the careful process of unpacking her things. She worked methodically, the way her father had always praised. Everything in its place. Every decision made once and not revisited. She hung her dresses, arranged her books on the small shelf beside the desk, set her medical kit, the worn leather satchel that had been her constant companion since she was 19, on the top of the wardrobe, where it was accessible but not immediately visible. She saved the gloves for last. There were 6 pairs. Linen for summer, kidskin for formal evenings, 1 pair of plain cotton she wore when she was working. She folded them carefully and laid them in the top drawer of the dresser, and she did not look at her own hands while she did it. She had not looked at her own hands, uncovered, in company, since she was 20 years old. She had no intention of starting now. Nathaniel Caldwell arrived home at 5:30. Eleanor heard his boots on the stairs before she heard his voice, a heavy, even tread, the walk of a man who has spent enough years in command that he no longer thinks about how he carries himself. It simply happens. She was in the sitting room adjacent to her bedroom, reading when the knock came. "Come in," she said. He was taller than she'd expected. Most descriptions she'd received from her father's solicitor, from the one brief letter Nathaniel himself had written, which had been correct and courteous and told her absolutely nothing about. The man himself had mentioned that he was a man of considerable presence. She had thought that was the kind of thing people said about wealthy landowners to make them seem more appealing than they were. She revised that opinion immediately. Nathaniel Caldwell was 6 feet if he was an inch, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who work their own land, regardless of what their finances allow them to avoid. He had dark hair touched at the temples with the earliest suggestion of gray, and a face that might have been handsome once and had settled into something more serious than that. Eyes the color of river water, changeable, neither warm nor cold, just present. He was 35. She knew that from the solicitor's papers. He looked it and not apologetically. "Miss Whitmore," he said. He stepped into the room and stopped a careful distance away. "I apologize for not being here when you arrived." "Please don't," she said. She set her books outside and rose, because it seemed the appropriate thing to do, though she was not going to stand there waiting for him to tell her. She could sit. "Your land doesn't wait for social schedules. I understand that." Something moved across his face. Not quite surprised. More like a small recalibration. "Margaret showed you the house?" "She showed me to my rooms. I explored a little on my own afterward." She paused. "I hope that was acceptable. This is your home now," he said. "You don't need my permission to walk through it." He said it flatly, without ceremony, as though he was stating a fact he'd already decided and was simply informing her of it. Eleanor found she appreciated that more than she'd expected to. "Then we understand each other," she said. He looked at her for a moment, really looked, the way people rarely bothered to with her anymore. Not with admiration, not with assessment exactly. More like he was trying to read the language of a book he hadn't encountered before, and wasn't sure yet whether he was going to find it worth the effort. "Supper is at 7, he said. "My sister will join us." "I look forward to it." He nodded once, turned and left. Eleanor sat back down, picked up her book, and did not read a single word of it for the next 20 minutes. Supper was not a disaster. Eleanor would give it that much. The food was the Caldwell kitchen, clearly knew what it was doing, and the dining room was the kind of space that made conversation feel both required and somehow beside the point. All high ceilings and candlelight, and the particular formality of old Virginia money. A portrait hung above the sideboard. Eleanor noticed it immediately. She had been watching for something like it since she arrived. The woman in the portrait was beautiful. Dark-eyed, fair-skinned, painted in the kind of soft blue that made her look like she'd been lit from within. She looked serene in the way of someone who has never had reason to be anything else. Eleanor did not ask who it was. She did not need to. The green beans are from our kitchen garden, Margaret said, across the table. It was the third thing she had said all evening. The first two had been answers to questions Eleanor had carefully posed about the county, about the nearest town. The kind of safe conversational geography a woman navigates when she is new somewhere and has not yet decided how much of herself to spend. "They're excellent," Eleanor said. "Do you manage the kitchen garden yourself?" "Clara does, the head housekeeper." Margaret paused. "Catherine used to manage it." Nathaniel's hand, reaching for his wineglass, stilled for a fraction of a second. "Your wife?" Eleanor said quietly. Margaret looked at her. "My brother's late wife."
Yes.
"She had good taste," Eleanor said. "In kitchens and in portraits both." The silence that followed that statement had a very particular quality to it. Eleanor kept her gaze level and her expression pleasant and let it sit there until someone else decided what to do with it. Nathaniel was the one who spoke. "She died 2 years ago," he said. "Fever." "I'm sorry," Eleanor said, and she meant it, simply and directly, without performing it. That kind of loss doesn't get easier with time. It just gets quieter. Nathaniel looked at her across the table. He held her gaze for 3 full seconds, long enough that Margaret Eleanor noticed in her peripheral vision, glanced between the two of them with an expression that was not quite suspicion and not quite something else she could name. "No," he said at last. "It doesn't." They finished supper with a degree of civility that Eleanor considered a modest success. She went to bed that night, lay in the dark in Catherine Caldwell's old room, and thought about all the ways this could go wrong. There were quite a few. The first week passed in a kind of careful orbit. Eleanor learned the house. She learned which floorboards creaked, which windows stuck in the summer heat, where the library was, and how many books it actually contained, versus how many of them were purely decorative. She learned that the cook's name was Bessie, that Bessie's husband worked the stables, and that Bessie held strong opinions about the proper way to prepare cornbread, and was not shy about sharing them. She learned that Nathaniel rose at 5, was in the fields or the study by 6, and did not emerge for the kind of mid-morning social visiting that most men of his station considered their due. He worked. Genuinely, seriously worked, in the way of a man who has never trusted anyone else entirely to do it for him. She learned that Margaret Caldwell was not cruel. That was perhaps the most important thing she learned, and it took her the better part of a week to be certain of it. Margaret was not cruel. She was grieving. She was guarding something, some idea of the way things were supposed to be, some shape of the world that had included her brother's first wife, and did not yet have a clear place for Eleanor. She watched Eleanor the way a woman watches a stranger picking up something irreplaceable, not with malice, but with the kind of careful anxiety that looks like hostility from a distance. Eleanor understood that completely. She did not take it personally. She took it carefully instead, the way you handle something fragile, giving it room. On the 6th day, she found something that changed her plans considerably. She had gone out in the early morning, the only tolerable time to go anywhere in a Virginia July, following one of the servants' paths she'd noticed behind the kitchen garden. The path led down through a stand of pines and opened out onto a back road, and the back road, if you followed it for half a mile, brought you to the edge of Caldwell land where the tenant farmers' cottages sat. Eleanor had not intended to go that far. She was simply walking, the way she walked when she needed to think clearly, long strides, arms loose at her sides, the particular rhythm of movement that settled her thoughts into something manageable. But she heard the child before she saw the cottage. A thin sound, high and miserable, the kind of crying that has been going on too long and has lost its urgency and become something constant and much more worrying. She went toward it. The woman who answered the door was perhaps 35, but looked a decade older, hollow-eyed, her dress dark with perspiration, her hands twisting together in the way of someone who has been frightened for a long time and doesn't know what to do with the fear. "Ma'am," she said, startled. "I'm Eleanor Whitmore," Eleanor said. "I'm staying at the manor. I heard your child. Is there something I can do?" The woman, whose name was Ruth, Eleanor learned, wife of one of the Caldwell tenant farmers, stared at her for a moment, with the particular wariness of someone who has not had many offers of help from people in Eleanor's position. "She's been feverish 3 days," Ruth said finally. "I don't know what to do. There ain't no doctor comes out this far." Ruth hesitated, then stepped back. Eleanor walked into the cottage, shrugged off her jacket, pushed her sleeves up to the elbow, the left arm, the right arm, automatic and unself-conscious the way it always was when she was working. Because when she was working, there was no room for anything except the work, and knelt beside the child's bed. She did not notice in that moment that Ruth was staring at her arms. She was already assessing the child. The girl's name was Hannah. She was 4 years old, with her mother's eyes and a fever that had been allowed to climb too high for too long, because there was no one nearby who knew what to do about it. Eleanor knew what to do about it. She had learned from Dr. Marsh in Richmond when she was 19, a year before the fire, and had continued learning on her own for the 7 years since. She carried her medical kit for exactly these reasons, and she sent Ruth's oldest boy back to the manor for it with precise instructions about which bag and which shelf. "And thank you very much. Hurry, please." While they waited, she told Ruth what to do about cool cloths and got the child to drink some water and assess the breathing and the color, and determined that this was bad but not catastrophic. That with the right treatment, the girl would come through. When the kid arrived, she worked steadily, methodically, talking to Hannah the whole time in the calm, unhurried voice she had discovered years ago was the most effective medicine she had in her possession. Not the words themselves, the tone. "You're all right. You're going to be all right. I've got you." Ruth stood in the doorway and watched. When Eleanor finally sat back on her heels and said, "The fever should break by morning. If it doesn't, come find me at the manor immediately. Here's what you watch for," and began listing the signs, she looked up and found Ruth crying. Not dramatically, just quietly, the way tired women cry when something finally goes right. "I didn't know," Ruth said. "The treatment isn't complicated. It just requires knowing." "No, ma'am." Ruth shook her head. "I didn't know you were a doctor." Eleanor paused. "I'm not. Not officially. Women don't. It's not something." She stopped herself. Started again. "I know enough to help. That's what matters today." Ruth looked at her arms. Eleanor followed her gaze and realized, belatedly, that she had been working with her sleeves pushed up for the last 2 hours, the way she always did, and that her scars had been visible the entire time. The scars ran from just above her left wrist to the inside of her elbow, and from the outer edge of her right forearm up across the back of her hand. They were old scars, 7 years old, silver white now, the kind that has finished its business and settled into permanence. Not dramatic, not grotesque. Just there, undeniably, the record of something that had happened and could not be undone. Eleanor looked at them for a moment. Then she pulled her sleeves down, buttoned her cuffs, and picked up her kit. "I'll check on Hannah tomorrow morning," she said. Early, before the worst of the heat, she walked back to the manor with the July sun full on her face, and did not think about what Ruth had seen or what she might say about it to anyone. Or she tried not to. She was not entirely successful. She told Nathaniel that evening, not about the scars. About the child. She found him in the study after supper, going over account books with the kind of focused attention that suggested he would rather be doing this than most other things available to him, and she knocked on the open door and waited for him to look up. "Your tenant farmers in the south cottages," she said. "The nearest physician, how far is it from them?" He sat back. "Dr. Beaumont is in Charlottesville, 12 miles. "And when do they typically see him?" A pause. "When I send for him. When something is serious enough to warrant it. Ruth Jennings' daughter has been running a dangerous fever for 3 days, Eleanor said. "I treated her this morning. She should recover. But 12 miles is a long way, Mr. Caldwell, when a child is burning up in July." He was looking at her with that measuring expression again, the one she'd noticed at supper their first night, the language he hadn't encountered before. Look. You treated her, he said. I have some medical knowledge. I've been studying since I was 19. You went out to the tenant cottages and treated a sick child. I heard her crying, Eleanor said simply. What would you have had me do? A long sigh on her face. Nothing different, he said at last quietly. I'd have had you do nothing different. Something shifted between them in that moment, small, barely perceptible, the way a door moves when someone on the other side leans against it. Not open, not yet, but no longer quite as firmly closed. I'd like to go back tomorrow morning, Eleanor said. And I'd like to ask if it's agreeable to you, whether there's some regular way to see to the medical needs of the people on your land. Not physicians for everything, just basic care, knowledge. That would be agreeable to me, Nathaniel said. He held her gaze. More than agreeable. Turn to go, Miss Whitmore. She stopped. Eleanor, he said, and then, after a beat, as though he was trying out the shape of it, my name is Nathaniel. If we're to live in the same house, we might as well use them. She looked back at him over her shoulder. Good night, Nathaniel. Good night, Eleanor. She went upstairs and sat at the writing desk and looked out at the Virginia dark for a long while before she lit the lamp. The second week brought 2 more sick children, a problem with an infected wound on one of the field workers, and a conversation with Margaret Caldwell that Eleanor had not expected and was not sure she had survived. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon. In the kitchen garden, where Eleanor had taken to spending an hour each day because it was cooler under the shade of the trellis work, and the smell of growing things settled something in her chest that needed settling. She was kneeling in the dirt beside the bean rows when she heard the footsteps and looked up to find Margaret standing there, watching her, with an expression Eleanor couldn't immediately read. My sister-in-law kept this garden, Margaret said. I know, Eleanor said. Clara told me. She had a gift for it, from what I understand. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Catherine was. She stopped. Pressed her lips together. Started again. She was kind. Not in the way people say about women to be polite. She genuinely was. She used to bring food out to the tenant cottages herself, before she got sick. Eleanor waited. She would have liked what you're doing, Margaret said. With the children. It was not an apology. It was not an offer of friendship, exactly. It was something more careful than either an acknowledgement, precisely worded, that opened a door just a crack and waited to see if Eleanor would understand how to come through it without breaking anything. She sounds like a woman worth knowing, Eleanor said. I'm sorry I didn't get the chance. Margaret looked at her for a long time. Then, without another word, she walked back inside. Eleanor went back to the beans, but something had changed. She could feel it, the way you feel a weather shift in your bones before you can see it in the sky. It was at the end of the second week that Eleanor made her first serious mistake. She did not think of it as a mistake at the time. She thought of it as carelessness, the ordinary, human carelessness of a woman who had been vigilant for 7 years and had finally, in the unfamiliar comfort of beginning to feel something like at home, allowed herself to slip. She had been treating the field worker, a man named George, whose infected arm wound had responded to treatment and was healing cleanly, and she had come in from the morning's work warm and distracted, already thinking about the letter she needed to write to her father and the supplies she wanted to order for the makeshift care kit she was building. She came into the front hallway and almost walked directly into Margaret Caldwell, and a woman Eleanor had not seen before. Margaret's eyes went immediately. Eleanor registered it a half-second too late down to Eleanor's arms. Both sleeves pushed up, both sets of scars entirely visible. Eleanor, Margaret said. She said it carefully, her voice doing something complicated that Eleanor couldn't fully interpret. This is Mrs. Hartwell. She's come to call. Mrs. Hartwell was perhaps 55, built with the particular solid authority of a woman accustomed to being the most important person in most rooms. She wore silk in July, which Eleanor had always considered a form of weaponry. Her eyes went where Margaret's had gone, and they stayed there a beat longer. "Miss Whitmore," Mrs. Hartwell said. Her tone was precisely surgically pleasant. "What a surprise. I had understood from Margaret that you'd just arrived. I see you've already made yourself quite at home." Eleanor lowered her arms, took exactly one breath, pulled her sleeves down and buttoned them with the automatic efficiency of 7 years of practice. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said, her voice, "what a pleasure. Won't you come and sit down?" She smiled. She led them to the parlor. She poured tea and made conversation, and said absolutely nothing about the scars or the questions she could see forming behind Mrs. Hartwell's careful eyes. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. But walking upstairs afterward alone, she felt something she recognized and did not particularly welcome the old familiar tightening in her chest, the awareness that she had been seen by someone she had not chosen to show herself to. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a small, cold certainty began to settle. Virginia society was small, county society smaller still. And Mrs. Hartwell had the eyes of a woman who had been storing up observations for 30 years and had never once misplaced one. Eleanor sat at her desk and wrote her letter to her father and did not tell him any of this. She had handled worse. She would handle this. She pressed her gloves smooth against the back of the drawer, buttoned her cuffs, and went down to help Bessie with the afternoon preparations. That was the thing about a life lived carefully. It required constant attention. And the one thing Eleanor had learned, in 7 years of practice, was that the moment you thought you were safe was the moment something always proved you wrong. Mrs. Hartwell came back 3 days later. Eleanor knew before she heard the carriage on the drive. She had been watching for it, the way you watch for weather, not with certainty, but with the particular readiness of someone who has learned that what's coming is almost always worse than what's already here. She was in the kitchen with Bessie when Clara came to find her. "Mrs. Hartwell's in the parlor, ma'am, with 2 other ladies." Eleanor dried her hands. Did she say what she wanted? "No, ma'am. Just that she'd come to call." Eleanor looked at her cuffs. Both buttons were fastened. Both gloves were upstairs in the drawer, where she had left them this morning, and she made the decision, in that moment, not to go up and retrieve them. She was not going to conduct herself like a woman who was ashamed of something she had no reason to be ashamed of. She walked to the parlor. There were 3 of them Mrs. Hartwell, a younger woman introduced as Mrs. Cavendish, who had the brittle, watchful look of someone always composing her next anecdote, and a pale girl of perhaps 20 who said almost nothing and seemed to be there mostly to witness. The social arithmetic of it was not subtle. Mrs. Hartwell had brought an audience. "Mrs. Caldwell," Mrs. Hartwell said, and the title landed in the room like a small stone dropped into still water. It was the first time anyone outside the house had called Eleanor that. She kept her face pleasant. "Mrs. Hartwell, how kind of you to visit. We wanted to welcome you properly to the county, Mrs." Hartwell's eyes moved briefly to Eleanor's cuffs. "I hope you're settling in. Very comfortably, thank you." "And the house agrees with you?" "It does." Mrs. Cavendish leaned forward with the practiced enthusiasm of a woman who has made a second career out of obtaining information under the cover of interest. "We've heard such wonderful things about your family, Mrs. Caldwell. Your father is the judge in Richmond?" "He was." "He's retired now, and your mother?" "She passed when I was 12. A practiced murmur of sympathy ran around the room like a rehearsed response. "You were educated at home?" Mrs. Hartwell said. "Largely, yes." Eleanor kept her hands relaxed in her lap, kept her voice light. She knew what this was. She had sat through versions of it her entire adult life, the polite excavation, the questions that weren't quite questions, the examination conducted entirely in the register of social courtesy. "I had an excellent tutor until I was 16, and afterward I pursued several areas of study independently." "Medical study," Mrs. Hartwell said. "Not a question." "Among others." A small silence. Mrs. Cavendish looked at Mrs. Hartwell. The pale girl looked at her hands. I understand you've been visiting the tenant cottages, Mrs. Hartwell said, rather regularly. The children on the estate needed attention, Eleanor said. It seemed the practical thing to do. Quite, Mrs. Hartwell set down her teacup with a precision that suggested the real part of this conversation was about to begin. I must say, Mrs. Caldwell, you are not quite what I expected. Eleanor smiled. I'm not sure what you expected. Something more, Mrs. Hartwell paused, selecting her words with the care of a woman who understands that the sharpest weapons can be delivered in the most pleasant tone. Conventional. I've always found convention to be most useful when it serves people, Eleanor said. And rather less useful when it doesn't. Another small silence. This one had a different quality than the first. Mrs. Hartwell looked at her for a long moment, and Eleanor held her gaze, without flinching, and without any of the performance of confidence that would have announced itself as defensive. She was simply steady. She had been steady for a very long time. Well, Mrs. Hartwell said at last, we shall look forward to seeing you at the Harrington dinner. Next Friday. I presume Nathaniel has mentioned it. He had not. Eleanor learned this when the women left and Margaret appeared in the parlor doorway with the expression of someone who has been listening from the hall and has thoughts about it. He forgot to tell you, Margaret said. It seems so. He forgets things like that. He always has a pause. Catherine used to keep his social calendar for him. Eleanor looked at her. Margaret looked back. Something passed between them, not warmth, exactly, but the specific acknowledgement of two women who have both noticed the same thing about the same man and are deciding, wordlessly, whether to discuss it. I'll speak to him this evening, Eleanor said. Good luck, Margaret said, and walked away. But Eleanor could have sworn just before she turned that the corner of Margaret's mouth had done something that was not quite a smile, but was closer to one than anything Eleanor had seen on her face before. She did speak to him that evening. She found him in the study, as she often did, and she stood in the doorway and said, The Harrington dinner. Next Friday. Nathaniel looked up from the account book. A pause. She watched him remember. I meant to tell you, he said. You forgot. He had the decency not to deny it. I did. I apologize. It's all right. She came into the room and sat in the chair across from his desk, the way she'd started to do when they needed to discuss household matters. She had learned, in the first week, that he thought more clearly when he wasn't looking directly at whoever he was talking to. And she had accordingly positioned herself at an angle. What do I need to know about it? It's the largest social occasion in the county this time of year. The Harringtons have 300 acres adjoining ours. Samuel Harrington is the county magistrate. His wife, F. Louisa, has Hastop. Seemed to be selecting his words. What kind of views? The kind that tend to become everyone else's views, whether they want them to or not. Eleanor absorbed this. And Mrs. Hartwell? Is she a friend of the Harringtons? She is Louisa Harrington's closest friend, has been for 30 years. A beat of silence. I see, Eleanor said. They came to call. This morning. Yes. Nathaniel set down his pen. And they were extremely polite, Eleanor said, in the way that suggests they're building toward something. He looked at her steadily. Are you worried? She considered the question honestly, the way she always tried to consider things. Not precisely. I've navigated rooms like that before. A pause. I'd just like to know what I'm walking into. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the county will form an opinion of you at that dinner. Whatever it is, it'll be the opinion you carry for a long time. And you, she said, have you formed an opinion? The question came out slightly differently than she intended, more direct, less casual, and she saw him register it. He held her gaze across the desk. I think, he said carefully, that you are not what I expected. Mrs. Hartwell said the same thing. It's not the same thing, he said. Something in the way he said it, simple, definitive, without performance, made Eleanor look at him more carefully than she had since she arrived. He was not a man who said things he didn't mean. She had understood that within the first 24 hours. He was also, she was beginning to understand, not a man who said things he did mean very easily or very often. "Thank you," she said, and meant it simply. He nodded once. Picked up his pen. She understood she was dismissed not rudely, just the way a man dismisses a conversation that has gone somewhere he needs to sit with before he continues, and she rose. She was at the door when he said, "Eleanor." She stopped. Turned. "Wear whatever you want to wear," he said. "To the Harrington dinner. Whatever you're comfortable in." She looked at him for a moment. "Even if that's something Mrs. Harrington doesn't approve of. Especially then," he said, and looked back at his book. Eleanor walked upstairs, sat at her writing desk, and found that her hands were not quite steady for the first time since she'd arrived at Caldwell Manor. She was not accustomed to men who meant that kind of thing. 3 days before the Harrington dinner, Nathaniel found her at the tenant cottages. She was working. Hannah was fully recovered and helping her mother shell peas on the front step, a fact that gave Eleanor a satisfaction so clean and simple it felt almost unfamiliar, and she heard the horse before she heard him. He dismounted and came toward her across the yard, and she stood and pulled her sleeves down, and then stopped herself and left them where they were. Because it was 84 degrees in Virginia in July, and she had been working for 2 hours, and she was tired of that particular performance. He saw her arms. She watched him see them. He did not look away or compose his expression in the careful way of someone deciding how to react. He just looked briefly, and then looked at her face. "How's the child?" he said. "Fully recovered," Eleanor said. "Helping with the peas, as you can see." He looked at Hannah, who looked back at him with the frank assessment of a 4-year-old, and something moved across his face that was softer than his usual expression. "Good," he said. They walked back along the path together, his horse following slowly. The morning was the kind of hot that settles into your bones and stays there, and the cicadas were so loud Eleanor had to pitch her voice slightly higher than usual to be heard. "How long have you had medical knowledge?" he said. Not asking the way Mrs. Hartwell had asked, not building toward anything. Just asking. "I started learning formally when I was 19, she said. "From a physician in Richmond, Dr. Marsh. He was willing to teach a woman," which was she paused. "Unusual. Why? Because most physicians weren't." He was quiet for a moment. "Why did you want to learn?" Eleanor considered how much to say. She had calibrated this question before the version she gave to people who didn't need the full answer, the version she gave to no one. She gave him something close to the full answer, because he had asked simply, and because he deserved simply in return. "My mother died of something a doctor could have treated," she said. "If he'd come sooner, if anyone had known what to watch for. I was 12, and there was nothing I could do, and I decided that if I ever had the chance to learn enough that I wouldn't have to stand there and watch something like that happen again." She stopped. "So I learned." He walked beside her and did not say anything for a moment. She appreciated that. Most people, when she told them this, immediately reached for something comforting to fill the silence, and she always found those something small and insufficient, and ultimately about their own discomfort more than her grief. Nathaniel Caldwell walked beside her and let the silence be what it was. "My wife died of fever," he said eventually, 2 years ago. There was a physician. He came from Charlottesville. A pause. He didn't come fast enough either. Eleanor looked at his profile. He was looking straight ahead, the horse's reins loose in his hand, his jaw set, in the particular way of someone carrying something heavy and accustomed to carrying it alone. "I'm sorry," she said, the same way she'd said it at supper, simply, without performance. "I should have made provisions sooner," he said, "for the estate. For regular medical access. I didn't," because he stopped. "It's the thing you don't think about until it's too late." "You're thinking about it now," Eleanor said. He looked at her then. "Yes," he said, "I am. They reached the gate where his horse would take him east toward the fields, and her path went north toward the house. He stopped. "The scars," he said, not asking, just naming. She held his gaze, did not move her arms, did not arrange herself into any particular posture. "A fire," she said, 7 years ago. "A warehouse on the edge of the Richmond dockyards. There were children inside. A long silence, not the uncomfortable kind. The kind that means someone is giving weight to what they've heard." "How many?" he said. "4," she said. "All of them lived." He looked at her for what felt like a very long time. The way he had looked at her that first morning in her sitting room, trying to read the language of something he hadn't encountered before. Except this time she had the sense that he was no longer deciding whether it was worth the effort. He had already decided. "You should know," he said, "that whatever is said at the Harrington dinner, whatever Louisa Harrington or Catherine Hartwell decides to say or imply." He paused. "It will not change anything. Here in this house. With me." Eleanor held very still. "You don't know what they'll say." "No," he said. "But I know what I know." He nodded once, tipped his hat in that spare, matter-of-fact way he had, and rode east. Eleanor stood at the gate in the July heat and put one hand flat against the wood post beside her, because her legs had done something unexpected and she needed a moment before she walked back to the house. She had not expected him. She had not expected any of this. She was not sure yet whether that was something to be afraid of. Margaret found her that evening in the upstairs sitting room, the one between their bedrooms, that had been a neutral territory neither of them had quite claimed. Eleanor was mending not because the work needed doing, she had told herself, but because her hands needed something to do while she thought. Her fingers were steady, her mind was considerably less so. "Mrs. Caldwell." Eleanor looked up. "Come in, Margaret." Margaret came in. She did not sit immediately, the way she had the habit of not sitting immediately, as though she needed to decide first that she was going to stay. Then she sat in the chair across from Eleanor and looked at the fire too warm for July, but someone had lit it for the light and said nothing for a moment. "Mrs. Hartwell will say something at the dinner," Margaret said. "I expect so. She said something to Louisa Harrington already. I know because I have a letter from a friend who heard it." Eleanor's needle stilled. "What did she say?" Margaret looked at her. "That Nathaniel married in haste. That there were irregularities about your appearance. That a woman who goes about ungloved among the tenants is—" She stopped. Her jaw tightened. The word she used was questionable. Eleanor set down the mending. "I see. She'll bring it up at the dinner. She'll find a way to do it publicly. Louisa Harrington will not stop her because Louisa Harrington never stops her from anything." Margaret paused. "I thought you should know." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. "Margaret," she said, "why are you telling me this?" The question sat there. Margaret looked at her hands. And then, in a voice that was different from any Eleanor had heard her use, stripped of its careful, controlled surface, showing something raw beneath. "Because whatever I thought when you came here," Margaret said, "you saved Ruth Jennings's daughter. And George Miller's arm. And you've been doing it quietly, without asking anyone to notice, for 2 weeks. And Catherine," she stopped. Her throat worked. "Catherine would have done the same thing. And I think," she stopped again, "I think I have not been fair to you." The room was very quiet. Eleanor looked at her carefully. "Then you lost someone you loved," she said, "and I arrived in her house. That's not a small thing to ask anyone to manage." Margaret blinked once rapidly. "No," she said, "it isn't." "I'm not her," Eleanor said. "I know that. I never tried to be." "I know." A pause. "I know that now." They sat in the fire-warm room in the July evening, and neither of them said anything for a while. But it was not the old silence, the careful, watched silence of two women circling each other, looking for the safest distance. It was something else, something new. After a while, Margaret said, "You need to wear long gloves to the Harrington dinner." Eleanor looked at her. Your brother told me to wear whatever I'm comfortable in. My brother, Margaret said with a particular dryness of a woman who has loved an oblivious man for 35 years, does not understand what Louisa Harrington is capable of. Eleanor almost smiled. I gathered long gloves won't hide everything. People will have heard the rumors by Friday, but they'll make it harder for someone to make a moment of it. A pause. Unless you'd rather give them the moment on your own terms. Eleanor looked at her. Is that what you'd do? Margaret considered this with genuine seriousness. Honestly, no, I would have fallen apart a beat. But you wouldn't. Eleanor picked up her mending again. I haven't decided yet. Whatever you decide, Margaret said, and her voice had settled into something that was not quite warmth, but was reaching for it. I'll stand beside you. Eleanor looked up from the mending, held her gaze. Thank you, she said. Margaret stood, smoothed her skirts, moved toward the door. She paused at the threshold. Eleanor, she said. And it was the first time she had used Eleanor's name, not Miss Whitmore, not Mrs. Caldwell. Eleanor. Like a choice. Yes, Nathaniel doesn't trust easily, Margaret said. He never has. But he told me this afternoon that he asked you about the scars and you told him the truth. He didn't say much else about it. She paused. He didn't need to. She left. Eleanor sat with the mending in her hands and the fire settling low and the Virginia night pressing warm against the windows, and she thought about all the things she had survived that had left marks on her, visible and otherwise. She thought about the 4 children who had all lived. She thought about Nathaniel at the gate, the reins loose in his hand, saying, I know what I know. She thought about Margaret, sitting in this room and saying, I think I have not been fair to you. She pulled her sleeve back, just slightly, and looked at the scars in the firelight. Silver white and permanent. The record of one night 7 years ago when she had made a choice that cost her something and saved 4 lives. They had never looked like damage to her. Not really. Not once she'd stopped seeing them through other people's eyes. She pulled her sleeve down, picked up her needle. Friday was coming. She was going to be ready. The morning of the Harrington dinner, 2 things happened that Eleanor had not anticipated. The first was that Ruth Jennings appeared at the back door of the manor at 7 in the morning, Hannah on her hip, with a basket covered in a cloth. I heard you were going to a dinner tonight, Ruth said. I brought these. She held out the basket. Inside, wrapped carefully, were 6 perfect peaches from someone's kitchen garden, still warm from the morning. I know it ain't much, I wanted to. Eleanor took the basket and looked at this woman who had stood in a doorway and let a stranger with scarred arms tend to her sick child without asking any of the questions she was undoubtedly thinking. It's a great deal, Eleanor said. Thank you. Ruth shifted Hannah on her hip. You'll be all right tonight? I heard Mrs. Hartwell has been talking. I'll be all right, Eleanor said. Ruth looked at her with the frank, unornamented eyes of a woman who has seen enough of the world to know when someone means something and when they're just saying it. Yes, she said after a moment. I reckon you will. She walked back down the path. Hannah looked back over her mother's shoulder and waved. Eleanor waved back. The second thing that happened was that Nathaniel knocked on the door of her sitting room at 8 o'clock, and when she said, "Come in," he came in holding something she hadn't expected. A small velvet box. Just a box. These were my grandmother's, he said. She wore them every day. He opened the box. Were 2 gloves, long ones, ivory kid leather, worked finely at the wrist with a pattern of small leaves. Old but beautifully kept. I found them in the east trunk room last year and didn't know what to do with them. Eleanor looked at the gloves, then at him. You don't have to wear them, he said quickly. I'm not asking you to hide anything. I just thought. He stopped. For the first time since she'd known him, Nathaniel Caldwell seemed to not quite know what he was saying, and she found that unexpectedly affecting. They're beautiful, he said finally, and you deserve beautiful things. That's all. Eleanor took the box from his hands. She looked at the gloves for a long moment. Thank you, she said. Nathaniel. He held her gaze. Are you afraid of tonight? The honest answer was complicated. I'm ready for it, she said. That's not the same thing. No, she agreed. It isn't. He was quiet for a moment. Then, whatever happens tonight in that room, I want you to know that my opinion of you was formed 2 weeks ago. It has not changed. And it will not change because of anything Louisa Harrington or her friends decide to perform. Eleanor looked at him steadily. Was it a good opinion? Yes, he said, simply and without hesitation. The best one I've formed in a long time. She could feel her heart doing something it had not done in years, something she had locked in a room inside herself and told herself she had no use for anymore. She opened the box again, lifted out one of the ivory gloves, slid it onto her left hand up to the elbow. The leather was soft and cool and fit better than it had any right to. She held up her gloved hand, looked at it. All right, she said. He nodded once, reached out, and with a careful, deliberate gesture that he did not rush and she did not flinch from, he smoothed one small wrinkle at the wrist of the glove. All right, he said. And that evening, Eleanor Whitmore, Eleanor Caldwell, walked into the Harrington house with her husband at her side and her husband's grandmother's gloves on her arms, and she held her chin at exactly the level she had always held it, which was the level that required no explanation and offered none. The room turned to look at her. She led it. Mrs. Hartwell was standing near the fireplace. Their eyes met across the room. Eleanor smiled not warmly, not coldly, but with the particular steadiness of a woman who knows exactly where she stands and has made her peace with the ground beneath her feet. The evening had not yet begun, but Eleanor was ready. She had always, when it came down to it, been ready. The Harrington house was full of candlelight and the particular kind of laughter that has nothing to do with anything being funny. Eleanor knew that laughter. She had grown up adjacent to it, the daughter of a judge, close enough to society to understand its rhythms but never quite at its center, always slightly outside the warmth of it, watching the way it worked. It was the laughter of people who were performing for each other, who had been performing for each other for so long they had forgotten there was any other way to be. She stood beside Nathaniel in the entrance hall, while Samuel Harrington, a broad, jovial man whose joviality did not quite reach his eyes, shook Nathaniel's hand and kissed Eleanor's, and said something about how delightful it was to have her in the county at last. And she smiled and said the appropriate things and felt the room adjusting itself around her presence, the way a body of water adjusts around something newly dropped into it. She could feel Mrs. Hartwell across the room without looking at her. 7 years of learning to sense that particular energy had made her sensitive to it, the way some people are sensitive to changes in barometric pressure, a tightening, a readiness. The knowledge that something is going to happen before you can see it forming. Louisa Harrington appeared at her elbow within 4 minutes. Eleanor had expected 5. She revised her estimate of the woman upward accordingly. Mrs. Caldwell. Louisa Harrington was perhaps 50, small-boned, with a particular kind of beauty that has learned to weaponize itself over decades. She took both of Eleanor's hands in hers and held them, and Eleanor felt the woman's fingers pause just briefly, barely perceptibly, on the long ivory gloves. What a treasure you are. We have been so looking forward to meeting you. The feeling is entirely mutual, Eleanor said. Nathaniel has been alone too long. Louisa's voice dropped into a register of practiced warmth. We all worried about him so after Catherine. Such a loss. You knew, of course, about Catherine. Of course, Eleanor said. She sounds like she was a remarkable woman. She was. Louisa held her gaze. She was one of us. The words landed like what they were, not a greeting, but a boundary. A line drawn in the parlor floor. She was one of us. The unfinished sentence complete in the pause that followed, and you are not. Eleanor smiled. I hope, in time, to earn a place in this community, she said. Through what I do. That's the only way I know how to belong anywhere. Louisa looked at her for one long beat. How refreshing," she said in a tone that meant nothing of the kind. She drifted away. Eleanor turned to find Nathaniel at her shoulder, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and she said nothing because there was nothing to say, and neither did he. And somehow that was the most steadying thing that had happened all evening. The dinner itself began at 8. 22 people at a table that seated 24, the 2 empty chairs at the far end, somehow making the arrangement feel more deliberate rather than less. Eleanor was seated to Samuel Harrington's left, which she recognized as a position of honor designed to look like a position of examination, close enough to the head of the table to matter, expose, that everyone could watch her manage it. She managed it. She talked to Samuel Harrington about land drainage and the price of tobacco and the difficulty of the summer heat on the wheat crop, and she could feel his surprise at the specificity of her knowledge, like a temperature shift across the table. She talked to the man on her left, a Colonel Pettigrew, retired, who had strong opinions about Napoleonic military strategy and was delighted to find someone who would engage with them seriously, and she held her own well enough that he called her a credit to her sex, which she accepted graciously, because she had learned that there are battles worth having and battles best left for another day. She did not look at Mrs. Hartwell. She did not need to. She could track her by the quality of attention in the room. The first move came between the fish course and the main. Mrs. Cavendish, the brittle, watchful woman from the previous visit, leaned forward from 3 seats down and said, in the carrying tone of someone who has calculated exactly how far it will carry, "Mrs. Caldwell, I understand you've been practicing medicine among the tenant families." The table didn't quite go quiet. It went the way a room goes when a group of people who have been waiting for something suddenly feel it beginning. Conversations dimmed by 1 degree. Heads turned with a precision that tried to look casual. Eleanor set down her fork. "I've been offering basic medical care to the families on the Caldwell estate," she said. "There are several children who needed attention, and no physician within a reasonable distance. It seemed the sensible thing to do." "How extraordinary, Mrs. Cavendish said. "Where does one learn such things?" "From a physician in Richmond. Dr. Marsh. He was generous with his knowledge." A pause. "Medicine isn't magic. Most of it is observation and patience and knowing what to watch for. I've found it of considerable use. But for a woman of your station, Mrs. Cavendish began. "A woman of my station," Eleanor said pleasantly, "has hands and a working mind. I've never seen the point of leaving either one idle." Colonel Pettigrew laughed a genuine laugh, surprised out of him. 2 other people down the table smiled. Samuel Harrington was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize, but which did not seem unfriendly. Mrs. Hartwell had not moved, had not spoken, was watching. Eleanor picked her fork back up. She had learned, at 20, that the way to survive a room that wants to see you flinch is to give it something else to watch instead. Not performance, not defiance, just competence, presence. The simple, immovable fact of yourself, clearly stated. She ate her dinner. The main course came and went. The conversation moved and shifted the way conversation does, at large dinners splitting into smaller eddies, rejoining, breaking apart again. Eleanor answered questions and asked them, and gave nothing away that she hadn't decided to give. Nathaniel, seated diagonally across the table near Louisa Harrington, caught her eye twice over the course of the meal. The first time, she gave him a slight nod that said, "I'm fine." The second time, she simply held his gaze for a moment and found, to her own surprise, that it helped. The steadiness she saw in his face reflected something back at her that she hadn't known she needed reflected. She looked away first, went back to Colonel Pettigrew. The dessert course arrived, and with it Margaret. Eleanor had not had the chance to speak to Margaret since they'd arrived. The seating had separated them, but she had been tracking her the way she tracked everything in a room she didn't fully control, peripherally and constantly. Margaret was across the table and 4 seats down, seated beside a young man who seemed pleasant and slightly terrified of her, and she had been conducting herself through dinner with the quiet, composed efficiency that Eleanor had come to recognize as Margaret's particular armor. Now, over the dessert course, Eleanor saw Margaret's eyes move to Mrs. Hartwell, saw something shift in Margaret's expression, saw her chin come up slightly, and Eleanor thought, she knows something is about to happen. She was right. Mrs. Hartwell's voice, when it came, was perfectly modulated. She had saved all evening for exactly this moment, for the dessert course when people were relaxed and the wine had done its work and guards were lowest. Mrs. Caldwell, she said, conversational, carrying. The whole table's attention swinging toward her like compass needles toward north. I meant to ask, the gloves, are they an affectation, or is there a practical reason? The table went the quiet it had been building toward all evening. Affectation. The word was chosen with a scalpel. It implied vanity, eccentricity, something slightly ridiculous. It invited laughter. It invited the table to look at Eleanor's gloves, conspicuous now, the only gloves at the table, and find them worthy of a smile. Eleanor set down her dessert spoon, took one breath, kept her face perfectly, completely still. Practical, she said. Oh, Mrs. Hartwell's eyebrows rose with practiced innocence. How interesting. I've always thought long gloves at dinner to be rather. I have scars on my arms, Eleanor said. The sentence dropped into the room like a stone. She had decided. She could not have explained precisely when somewhere between Mrs. Hartwell's first word and her own last breath, in the space of a heartbeat, she had decided. Not to hide, not to wait for it to be taken from her. To say it herself, plainly, in her own words, in her own voice, before anyone else could arrange the telling of it. From a fire, she continued. She looked directly at Mrs. Hartwell. 7 years ago, a warehouse on the Richmond dockyards. There were 4 children inside. I went in, they came out. My arms did not escape undamaged. She paused for one beat. I wear the gloves in company as a courtesy, not a concealment. Tonight I wore my husband's grandmother's gloves, because they are beautiful, and he offered them to me, and I am rather fond of beautiful things. Silence. Not even the sound of silverware. Eleanor looked around the table. She did not look for sympathy. She did not look for anything. She simply looked, the way she had looked at rooms her entire adult life, clear-eyed, present, unwilling to pretend she didn't see what she saw. Samuel Harrington spoke first. 4 children, he said. His voice had changed from the jovial tenor of the evening host. All living, Eleanor said. The youngest was 2. She's 8 years old now in Richmond. I received a letter from her mother last spring. Another silence, different in texture from the first. Then Colonel Pettigrew said, with the straightforward bluntness of a military man who has left social calculation behind somewhere in his 60s, "By God, ma'am." That's something. It was a long time ago, Eleanor said simply. I don't tell the story for sympathy. I tell it because Mrs. Hartwell asked a direct question, and I think direct questions deserve direct answers. She looked at Mrs. Hartwell again, held her gaze, steady, unflinching, not aggressive. She had no anger left for this, had burned through all of that years ago, just present. Just true. Mrs. Hartwell said nothing. For the first time all evening she said absolutely nothing. And in that silence, Nathaniel Caldwell stood up. Eleanor had not expected it. She had been watching him in her peripheral vision, had seen him start to rise, and something in her chest had tightened because she did not want him to rescue her. She had just rescued herself. Had done it cleanly and completely, and she did not need. But that was not what he did. He stood, and he lifted his glass, and he looked at his wife across the table. And his voice, when he spoke, was the same quiet, definitive voice he always used, the one that didn't perform, didn't ornament, didn't reach for effect. I would like to propose a toast, he said, to my wife Eleanor Caldwell, who has, in 3 weeks, treated 6 children, 2 field workers, and 1 stubborn case of summer fever on this estate, all without being asked, all without requiring thanks, and all with a degree of skill that has put me to shame for not having arranged the same myself sooner." He paused. "And who, it appears, has rather more of a story than any of us deserve to know this evening." He held up his glass. The table was very still, and then Samuel Harrington lifted his, and Colonel Pettigrew lifted his with a small sound of approval. And one by one, the glasses came up around the table. Not all of them. Mrs. Hartwell's stayed where it was. Mrs. Cavendish's stayed where it was, but enough of them. Enough that the room had shifted on its axis, tilted in a direction that no amount of subsequent maneuvering was going to fully correct. Eleanor looked at her husband across that table, full of candlelight and Virginia crystal and the particular complicated wreckage of what had just happened. And she held his gaze, and she did not perform gratitude or relief or any of the emotions moving through her too quickly to name. She just looked at him. He looked back. She picked up her glass. They drank. The evening ended within the hour. Dinners, Eleanor had found, tend to collapse quickly. Once their defining moment has passed, there is nothing left to build toward, and so people begin finding reasons to depart. The carriages came. The coats were fetched. Mrs. Hartwell left without speaking to Eleanor. She had managed this by the specific technique of always being in conversation with someone else whenever Eleanor was within greeting distance, which was a sophisticated enough avoidance that Eleanor could almost admire it. Louisa Harrington, however, caught Eleanor at the door. "Mrs. Caldwell." Her voice was different from earlier in the evening. Not warm. Louisa Harrington was not a woman who moved quickly toward warmth. But different, measured, as though she were recalculating. "I understand you studied with Dr. Marsh. In Richmond." "I did," Eleanor said. "My youngest daughter has a condition," Louisa said. Her voice was carefully controlled, but Eleanor had learned to hear what was underneath careful control. "She has had it since childhood. The physicians I've consulted have been a pause." Inconsistent. Eleanor looked at her steadily. "I would be happy to speak with you about it, if that would be useful. Not as a physician, I'm not that, but as someone who has read widely and observed a great deal." Louisa looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across her face that Eleanor had not expected to see there, something that looked uncomfortably like relief. "Yes," she said. "I think that would be useful." She moved away. Eleanor stood in the doorway and let out one long, controlled breath. Nathaniel appeared at her side. He had her wrap, she had forgotten she'd brought one, and he set it around her shoulders with the same quiet, deliberate care with which he'd smoothed the glove that morning. "All right," he said. "More than all right," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "You didn't need me to stand up." "No," she said, "I didn't, I know." He paused. "I stood up because I wanted to. Because what you said deserved to be said, and the table needed to hear that I agreed with every word of it." Another pause. Shorter. "And because it's the first time I've been proud in a very long time, and I had forgotten what that felt like." Eleanor looked at him in the dark of the Harrington doorstep, the July night full of cricket sound and the warm smell of Virginia earth, and she thought, "I did not expect you." She didn't say it. Not yet. It was too new, too precisely calibrated, the kind of thing that wants to be said at the right moment, and not a moment before. "Let's go home," she said instead. "Yes," he said. They walked to the carriage together, and if his hand found hers in the dark, and if she did not pull it away, but held it solid and warm and real, neither of them said anything about it. Some things did not require words yet. Margaret was waiting up. Eleanor saw the light under the sitting-room door when they arrived home, and she went upstairs alone, Nathaniel to the study, she presumed. Or to walk the grounds the way she had learned he sometimes did when there was something he needed to think through, and she knocked. "Come in," Margaret said. Eleanor came in. Margaret was in the chair by the cold fireplace with a book she clearly had not been reading, and she looked up and read Eleanor's face in the practiced way of someone who has spent a long time learning the faces of the people she loves. "Tell me," Margaret said. So Eleanor told her. "All of it, Mrs." Hartwell's question, her own answer, Nathaniel standing up, Samuel Harrington's toast, Louisa Harrington at the door. Margaret listened without interrupting, which Eleanor had come to understand was one of her particular gifts, the ability to hold a silence while someone fills it, without crowding. When Eleanor finished, Margaret was quiet for a moment. "She asked you directly about the gloves," Margaret said. "Yes, and you told the whole table."
Yes.
Margaret looked at her for a long time. "Are you glad you did?" Eleanor thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said. "I should have done it years ago. Not at that table, necessarily, but somewhere. I've been carrying the weight of other people's discomfort about my own arms for 7 years, and tonight I just set it down." She paused. "It turns out it wasn't as heavy as I thought, once I actually let go of it." Margaret was very still. Catherine never had to carry anything like that, she said. Her life was easy, not because she was weak. She wasn't, but because everything she stopped. Fit. For her, everything fit. "That sounds like a gift," Eleanor said. It was. Margaret looked down at her hands. "I spent 2 years after she died thinking that was what a wife should be. What Nathaniel needed. Something that fit." She paused. "I was wrong." Eleanor did not say anything. "He doesn't need something that fits," Margaret said. "He needs someone who can stand in a room full of Louisa Harrington's dinner guests and make them feel small for asking the wrong questions." A very small pause. "He needs you, specifically, I see that now." The room was very quiet. Eleanor felt something behind her sternum, something that had been tight for a very long time ease by precisely 1 degree. It was not resolution, it was not happiness exactly. It was the feeling of a door opening that had been closed. For so long she had forgotten what light looked like from the other side. "Thank you," she said, and meant it so completely that she didn't try to say anything else. Margaret nodded, stood, moved toward her own bedroom door. "Eleanor," she said, not turning. "Yes, take the gloves off. When you're in this house." A pause. "You don't need them here." She went through the door. Eleanor sat alone in the room for a moment. Then slowly she reached up and unbuttoned the left glove. Slid it off, set it on the arm of the chair, then the right. She looked at her own hands in the lamplight. The scars silver white and permanent and exactly what they had always been, the record of a night when she had made a choice and 4 children had lived. And she had carried the evidence of it on her skin for 7 years and tried very hard not to let it be the most important thing about her. She thought it might be time to stop trying. 3 days after the Harrington dinner, something shifted in the county. Eleanor noticed it gradually, the way you notice a change in weather, not as a single event but as an accumulation of small signs. The quality of the looks she received when she went into the market town with Bessie. The note that arrived from Mrs. Sarah Dunmore, wife of the county clerk, asking if Eleanor might consider calling at her convenience, as she had a question of a medical nature. The conversation she overheard between 2 women at the dry goods counter that stopped when she entered, and resumed after a moment. With a different subject, not the hostile silence of concealment, but the ordinary rerouting of people who have been talking about something and suddenly find its subject standing in front of them. They had been talking about her. She understood that. What was different from what she'd feared was the tone of what she caught in that moment of resumption, not scandal, not censure, but something closer to curiosity. The productive kind. The kind that could become, over time, something more useful. She did not delude herself that Mrs. Hartwell had been silenced. Women like Mrs. Hartwell were never silenced. They simply redirected. The narrative would shift. Eleanor was strange. Eleanor was aggressive. Eleanor was not what Nathaniel needed, and it would find its audience somewhere, because it always did. But the room had tilted. She had felt it tilt, And sometimes if you can get a room to tilt even slightly in your favor, that is enough. She was in the front sitting room, with Margaret on a Thursday morning, going over the household accounts Margaret had offered to show her the system Catherine had used. Another door opening quietly on its hinges when Clara knocked to say there was a visitor. Not a calling visitor. A woman at the back door asking for the lady of the house. Which lady? Eleanor said. She asked for you specifically, ma'am. By name. Eleanor went. The woman at the back door was perhaps 40 thin, with the particular combination of dignity and exhaustion that Eleanor had learned to recognize as the signature of someone who has been managing something difficult alone for a long time. She held a child's hand on each side of her, a boy of about 7 and a girl perhaps 5, and she introduced herself as Mrs. Amelia Ford, wife of a farmer 3 miles up the county road. I heard what you said at the Harrington dinner, Mrs. Ford said. Her voice was direct, no nonsense, the voice of a woman who has decided she is going to say what she came to say and isn't going to dress it up. About going into the fire. About the children, Eleanor said. My boy, Mrs. Ford said. She looked down at the 7-year-old. He looked back at Eleanor, with eyes that were slightly too bright and a pallor she noticed immediately. He's been unwell since March. I've had Dr. Beaumont out twice. He said. She stopped, steadied herself. He said there's nothing to be done. That some children are just like this. Eleanor looked at the boy. Then she crouched down to his level, the way she always did, because there was something important about meeting a child at eye height, about letting them see your face before they had to let you see theirs. What's your name? She said. Thomas, he said. His voice was thin but not weak. He had his mother's directness. Thomas, I'm Eleanor. Would you mind if I asked you some questions? He considered this with the gravity of a 7-year-old, weighing an important decision. All right, he said. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked up at his mother. Come inside, she said. I'll make tea, and Thomas and I are going to have a conversation. Mrs. Ford's exhale was 3 months' worth of held breath leaving all at once. Eleanor took the children inside, and Margaret, who had appeared in the hallway and read the situation in one glance, said to Mrs. Ford quietly, Come with me, I'll get the tea. They worked together for the next 2 hours. Eleanor with the boy, Margaret with the mother. The house organized itself around the need, without anyone having to say so. It was the first time that it happened. Eleanor noticed. She thought Margaret noticed too. Neither of them said anything about it. When the Fords left Eleanor with a new treatment plan, Thomas with a piece of Bessie's cornbread and a promise to come back in a week, Eleanor stood in the kitchen and felt something she had not felt in this house yet, or perhaps anywhere in years. The particular specific piece of being exactly where you are supposed to be. She was still standing there when Nathaniel came in from the fields, dusty and warm and clearly ready for water and a chair, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at her and said, What happened? A family came, she said. They needed help. He looked at her for a moment. Read something in her face, and you helped them. We helped them, she said. Margaret kept the mother calm for 2 hours. She was remarkable. Something moved across his face at that surprise, and something warmer than surprise, and then a kind of relief that looked as though it had been a long time coming. Good, he said. Then after a pause, I've been in contact with Dr. Beaumont. I've arranged for him to come to the estate once a month. And I've spoken to 2 other landowners in the county about doing the same. He paused. It will cover most of the families between us, if we coordinate. Eleanor stared at him. It was your idea, he said. I just made the arrangements. She kept staring. He had the expression of a man who has done something he considers obvious and is mildly puzzled by the response. Nathaniel. That is. She stopped. Try it again. That's going to matter to a great many people. Yes, he said. That was rather the point. He went to get his water. Eleanor stood in the kitchen and thought that she needed to revise, significantly, the story she had been telling herself about what this marriage was and what it might become. It was a bigger story than she'd allowed herself to imagine. She was not sure yet whether that was frightening or wonderful. She suspected, leaning against the kitchen doorframe in the July afternoon heat, listening to Bessie's commentary on the state of the bread and Nathaniel's steps in the hallway and the sound of Margaret's voice upstairs, she suspected it might be both. And that, she thought, pulling off her glove to reach for a peach from Ruth's basket on the counter, her scarred hand bare and unhidden and entirely her own. That was something she could live with, something she could, for the first time in a long while, live well with. The thought settled into her like the July heat, warm and total and everywhere at once. She picked up the peach, took a bite, let the sweetness sit. She did not put the glove back on. Thomas Ford came back the following week as promised. He came with his mother and his sister and a color in his face that had not been there before, still pale, still thin, but with something behind his eyes that had shifted from endurance to something approaching interest in the world around him. Eleanor saw it the moment he came through the door and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing working the way it was supposed to. "He slept," Mrs. Ford said. Her voice carried the particular quality of someone reporting a miracle they are still not entirely sure they deserve. 3 nights in a row. Properly. Since March he hasn't slept more than 2 hours together. "The compress," Eleanor said. "Every evening the way you showed me." "And the willow bark tea? He drinks it without complaining now. Says it tastes like the creek." Mrs. Ford looked at her son with the expression of a woman who has been frightened for a very long time and is just beginning to understand that the fear might not be permanent. "I don't know how to thank you. Come back in 2 weeks," Eleanor said. "And write down anything that changes, better or worse." "I want to know." Mrs. Ford nodded. Then quietly, "Mrs. Caldwell, I told 6 women about you this. 3 of them want to come." Eleanor looked at her. She said, "Any morning." They left. Eleanor stood in the hallway and knew, with the particular clarity of a thing becoming real, that something had just crossed a threshold. Not a small threshold, the kind you can't uncross. Nathaniel was in the doorway of the study. She had not heard him come in from the fields. 6 women, he said. She told 6 women. He looked at her for a moment. "We're going to need more supplies." "Yes," she said. "I'll write to Dr. Beaumont. He'll know what to order." "I have a list already," she said. "I've had one for a week." Something moved across his face, that expression she had been learning to read, the one that was not quite a smile but was warmer than his usual steadiness. The one that appeared when she said or did something that surprised him in a direction he approved of. He had it more often now than he had 3 weeks ago. She had noticed. She thought he probably didn't know she'd noticed. "Of course you do," he said. He went back to his study. She went to find her list. The 6 women arrived over the following 10 days in 1s and 2s, the way people come to things they are not entirely sure they are allowed to want carefully, with excuses ready. Prepared to retreat if the thing turns out to be less than they hoped. They did not retreat. Eleanor worked with each of them at the kitchen table, or in the small back sitting room that had become, by unspoken consensus, hers. She answered questions that had been carrying for years about children, about their own bodies, about symptoms they had been told were hysteria or weakness, or simply the cost of being female in a body that had been asked to do too much. She listened. She explained. She gave them language for things they had only had silence for before. Bessie, who had been watching all of this with the expression of a woman who has seen a great many things in her life and is assessing where this one ranks, brought cornbread without being asked on the 3rd day, and tea on the 4th. And by the end of the 2nd week had positioned herself as the unofficial organizer of who came in and who waited and how long. Margaret handled the logistics of it with a quiet competence that Eleanor had stopped being surprised by, because Margaret's quiet competence turned out to be considerable and ran in directions Eleanor was still discovering. She kept track of names and dates and what Eleanor had said to whom. She corresponded with two women whose husbands would not let them come to the manor directly, writing letters that were both gentle and precise. She managed, without anyone asking her to, the complicated social geography of who knew whom and who could be trusted and who could not. On the 12th day, Eleanor sat across from Margaret at the kitchen table after the last woman had left and looked at the list of names Margaret had compiled and said, "You should have been a physician." Margaret looked up a pause. "Women aren't physicians." "Women aren't officially physicians," Eleanor said. "You know the difference." A longer pause. Something shifted behind Margaret's eyes, something that had been closed for a long time opening just slightly at the hinges. "Catherine used to say I had a talent for organization," she said. "I always thought that was a kind way of saying I was controlling." "Organization and control are different things," Eleanor said. "Control is about what other people do. Organization is about making it possible for the right things to happen." Margaret looked at the list in front of her for a moment. "Then, what are we doing here, Eleanor? What is this actually?" Eleanor considered the question honestly. "I don't know yet what to call it," she said. "But I know what it is. It's women being heard about their own lives." "That's rarer than it should be." Margaret was quiet. Then, very quietly, "Yes, it is." They looked at each other across the kitchen table, and something settled between them, not the absence of difference, but the decision that difference was not the most important thing. They had both been lonely in ways they hadn't named. They were in this kitchen, in this house, in this accumulating thing that neither of them had planned, becoming less so. Eleanor picked up the list. "We need a name for what we're doing," she said. "If we're going to tell people how to find us." Margaret almost smiled. "Something that won't alarm the county too much." "Something accurate but not alarming," Eleanor agreed. "Is that possible?" "We'll see." The letter came on a Tuesday. Eleanor was at the writing desk in her sitting room when Clara brought it up on a small silver tray. The Caldwell house had all the formal habits of its station, even in informal moments, and Eleanor recognized her father's handwriting on the outside and felt the particular complicated feeling of being a daughter who has made choices her parent did not entirely endorse and is still waiting to find out how that will be resolved. She opened it. Judge Whitmore's letters were like the man himself, precise, measured, economical with sentiment, the kind of prose that communicates more in what it doesn't say than what it does. He wrote about Richmond and the heat and the business of his retirement. He asked about the estate and the household and whether she was comfortable. And then, near the bottom of the page, in handwriting that was slightly less controlled than the rest, as though the next sentence had required a different quality of effort, "I have heard several accounts of your conduct at the Harrington dinner. I will not pretend I was not initially alarmed. But I received a letter this week from Samuel Harrington himself, who tells me that his wife has consulted you about their youngest daughter, and that the county considers itself fortunate to have you. I am not certain I deserve credit for how you turned out. I am quite certain I am proud of you. Your mother would have been prouder still." Eleanor read the paragraph twice. Then she folded the letter carefully, set it in the drawer of her writing desk, and sat for a long time looking at nothing in particular. She had not cried in front of another person in 7 years. She was not going to cry now. But she sat with the particular fullness of her father's words, "Your mother would have been prouder still," and let it be what it was, which was the thing she had been waiting to hear, longer than she had allowed herself to acknowledge. When she came downstairs, Nathaniel was in the hall, about to go out. He looked at her face. He did not say anything immediately, which was one of the things about him she had come to value most, the capacity to read a room, and not fill it with himself. "Good news," he said finally. "My father," she said. "He's heard about the dinner. And he's proud of me." She said it simply because it was simple, the words, themselves doing the work without decoration. "He doesn't say that easily." Nathaniel held her gaze. No, he said. I imagine he doesn't. A pause. He should be. She looked at him for a moment. You say things like that very easily, she said. For a man who I'm told doesn't say things easily. Something shifted in his expression. I've found, he said carefully, that some things are easier to say than they used to be. I'm not sure yet whether that's your influence or simply he paused. Time. Could be both, she said. Could be, he agreed. And there was something in the way he agreed, the small, specific warmth of it, that made her look away first. He went out. She went back upstairs. She sat at the writing desk and wrote her father a letter that was 3 pages long and told him almost everything. The twist came from a direction Eleanor had not been watching. She had been watching Mrs. Hartwell. She had been watching the county and the slow, complicated work of reputation being rebuilt, one conversation at a time. She had been watching Thomas Ford's recovery, and the growing list of women who came to the back door of Caldwell Manor, and the way the house itself had started to feel different, warmer, busier. More like a place where things happened than a place where a widower waited out his life. She had not been watching Margaret, not carefully enough. Not for the right things. It was Bessie who noticed first, and Bessie who came to Eleanor on a Thursday morning with the combination of loyalty and bluntness that Eleanor had come to understand was Bess's particular language of love. Miss Margaret, Bessie said. She ain't right. Eleanor looked up from the medicines she was sorting. What do you mean? She don't sleep. She thinks nobody notices, but I've been in this house 20 years, and I notice everything. Bessie set down the tray she was carrying, with a firmness that was its own kind of punctuation. She was up at 3 last night, and the night before. I heard her. Eleanor set down the bottle she was holding. Is she ill? Not in her body, Bessie said, and looked at Eleanor with the steady eyes of a woman who has said all she is going to say, and is waiting to see whether the person she said it to will understand. Eleanor understood. She went upstairs and knocked on the sitting room door between their bedrooms, and when Margaret said, "Come in," she went in and found Margaret at the writing desk, with a letter she was clearly not writing. The pen was dry. The page was blank. And Margaret's hand was flat on the wood surface beside it, as though she needed to feel something solid. Eleanor did not ask permission. She sat down in the other chair, the way Margaret had sat in hers weeks ago, with the same lack of preamble, and she said, "Tell me." A long silence. "I found something," Margaret said. Her voice was controlled with the effort of someone holding a great deal at a very precise distance. In the east trunk room. When I went looking for it, doesn't matter why I was there. She stopped. There were letters. Catherine's letters. Written to a friend in Philadelphia, someone she'd known before her marriage. They spanned the last year of her life. Eleanor waited. She was unhappy, Margaret said. The words fell into the room and neither of them moved. She loved Nathaniel, I don't doubt that. But she wrote about feeling useless. About the estate being his world and having nothing that was her own. About missing the life she'd had before. Margaret's jaw was tight. She wrote that she felt like a beautiful piece of furniture. Something chosen for how she looked in the room. Eleanor felt something cold move through her. Does Nathaniel know? No. He doesn't know the letters exist. Margaret's hand pressed harder against the desk. And here is the thing I cannot stop thinking. She was unhappy. And I spent 2 years after her death trying to preserve the image of her life as though it were perfect. As though preserving the image was the same as honoring her memory. She stopped. It wasn't. No, Eleanor said quietly. She needed what you have, Margaret said. The words came out with a force that suggested they had been held back for some time. She needed something of her own. She needed to be useful in a way that mattered to her. She needed someone to. She stopped. She needed someone to see her the way Nathaniel sees you. The room was very still, and he didn't, Eleanor said. Not as an accusation, just as the truth of it. No. Margaret's eyes were bright now with the specific brightness of someone who has not slept enough and has been carrying something too heavy for too long. He loved her. I believe that completely. but he loved the idea of her life the way it was arranged. He didn't ask. Her voice broke slightly on the last word. Recovered. He didn't ask if it was what she wanted. Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. Are you going to tell him? I don't know. Margaret moved to the window, stood with her back to Eleanor and her arms wrapped around herself. I don't know what telling him does, except hurt him with information he can't use anymore. It might let him grieve what actually happened, Eleanor said. Instead of the version he's been carrying. Silence. And it might, Eleanor continued carefully, explain some things. About why he arranged this marriage the way he did. About what he thought a wife needed to be. She paused. He chose a practical arrangement because he thought that was safe. That practicality wouldn't fail. Margaret turned around. Her eyes went to Eleanor's face and stayed there. He's not doing that anymore, she said. No, Eleanor agreed, he's not. Something shifted in Margaret's expression, a complicated movement of guilt and grief, and something that might, eventually, if given enough time and air, become peace. She would have liked you, Margaret said. I've thought about that a great deal. She would have genuinely liked you. I'm sorry I didn't get to know her, Eleanor said. And meant it. Margaret nodded, turned back to the window. I'll tell him, she said, not today, but I'll tell him. Eleanor stood. When you do, she said, I'll be here. She went back downstairs. She picked up the bottle she had set down and went back to her sorting, and her hands were steady, and her mind was moving very fast through the implications of what she had just been told. And somewhere in the middle of all of it was the thought, he is going to need to hear this. And the other thought, arriving right behind it, I want to be the person he comes to after. That was new. She had not wanted that before, not with this specificity, not with this particular weight. She had wanted this marriage to be workable. She had wanted to be useful and respected and not diminished. She had not let herself want, precisely and urgently, to be the person Nathaniel Caldwell came to when something broke. She stood in the back room with the medicines and let herself want it. It was terrifying. It was also, she realized, exactly what it was supposed to feel like. Nathaniel came to her that evening. She was in the front sitting room with the lamp lit, writing notes on Thomas Ford's treatment, when she heard his knock. Not the study knock, she had learned the difference. The study knock was two sharp raps, businesslike. This was one. Slower. Come in, she said. He came in. He was still in his field clothes. He had not changed for supper, which he had retouched, a fact Eleanor had noticed and filed away. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and she looked at him and said nothing, just waited. And he came in and sat in the chair across from her and put his forearms on his knees and looked at the floor. Margaret spoke to me, he said. Eleanor set down her pen. Yes. She told you first. She told me she was going to tell you. A pause. I didn't know the contents of the letters. He was quiet for a moment. His hands were clasped between his knees, and she could see the tension in them, the particular held quality of a man who has been given information he is still processing and has not yet decided what to do with the feeling it has produced. She was unhappy, he said, and I didn't know. No. He looked up. Did you know before she told you? Eleanor considered the question carefully. I knew that the arrangement of Catherine's life sounded like one that would not have suited me. I didn't know what it suited her. He held her gaze. That's an honest answer. It's the only kind I have. He was quiet again. She let him have the silence, gave it freely, the way he had given silences to her. I loved her, he said. I want you to know that. I'm not saying I didn't. I know you did, Eleanor said. Margaret never doubted it either. That isn't the question. He looked at her. What's the question? Whether love is sufficient, Eleanor said, without attention. Without asking. She paused. Love that doesn't ask, are you all right? That's a kind of love that lives mostly in the person doing the loving. A long silence. His jaw worked. She could see him receiving this, sitting with it, not deflecting. That's true, he said finally. Of how I loved her. Yes. It doesn't make you a cruel man, Eleanor said. It makes you a man who had learned one way of doing something and hadn't been asked to learn another. He looked at her for a very long time, and now he said, "And now," she said, "you're being asked." The room was very still. Outside, the July night was doing its particular summer thing, full of sound and warmth, the world going on with its business regardless of what happened inside any given house, which Eleanor had always found both humbling and strangely comforting. "Eleanor," he said, and then stopped. She waited. "I owe you an honest accounting," he said, "of why I arranged this marriage the way I did, of what I thought I was doing." "You don't owe me anything. I want to tell you." A pause, different from the others, deliberate, the kind of pause a man uses when he is about to say something he has not said before. "I thought I was being practical. I told myself that was wisdom, that a practical arrangement would be safe. That I would not love a woman the way I had loved Catherine, and then fail to see that she was." He stopped. "I thought if I chose carefully and kept a certain distance, I could not make the same mistake." "And now," she said. Her voice was very quiet. He looked at her hands, both of them, bare, the scars visible in the lamplight, her left hand resting on the page of her treatment notes. He looked at them the way he'd looked at them that morning, at the gate, not with pity, not with the careful management of reaction, just with clear and present seeing. "Now," he said, "I find I don't want a safe distance." He met her eyes. "I find I want to ask." Her chest did something complicated, and she let it. "Then ask," she said. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes steady on hers. "Are you all right?" he said. "Not about the county, not about the women who come to the door, not about Mrs. Hartwell or the Harrington dinner. Are you all right, Eleanor? In this house? In this life? He stopped himself. In this marriage?" She held his gaze, took one breath. "I am becoming more all right," she said, "than I have been in a very long time." "That's not all right," he said. "That's something better." "Yes," she said. "It is," he exhaled. Long, quiet, the sound of a man setting something down that he has been carrying too long. "Then I should like to continue in that direction," he said. "If you're agreeable." "I'm agreeable," she said. He almost smiled. The almost smile was, she had decided, one of the most affecting things about him, the way it arrived at the very edge of his face and didn't quite complete itself, which made you feel you had seen something real rather than performed. "Good," he said. He stood to go. He paused at the door. Turned back, and she knew before he turned that he was going to, because she had learned his rhythms, and this was a rhythm, the thing said at the door, the afterthought that was not an afterthought at all. "The letters," he said. "Catherine's letters." A pause. "I'm glad Margaret told me." Even though he stopped. "I'm glad I know what was true. I'd rather carry the true thing than the comfortable version." "Yes," Eleanor said. "I thought you would." He looked at her for one long moment. "You already knew that about me," he said. "I've been paying attention," she said simply. He nodded once. Went. Eleanor sat in the lamplight and looked at her own bare hands on the treatment notes and thought about what it meant to be seen clearly, not for the best version of yourself. Not for the version that fit neatly into someone else's idea of what you should be, but for exactly what you were. Scars and knowledge and stubbornness and the particular kind of strength that comes from having made hard choices alone for a very long time. She had thought, arriving at Caldwell Manor, that this was a practical arrangement. She had thought she understood what she was walking into. She looked at the door where he had stood. She thought about the way he said, "Are you all right?" Eleanor, her name at the end, not at the beginning, the way it came last, as though it were the most important part. She had been wrong about what she was walking into. She was not sorry. The following week brought a complication she had not anticipated. Dr. Beaumont came for his first scheduled visit to the estate on a Monday morning. Arriving with his bag and his professional seriousness, and the expression of a man who has agreed to something that seemed reasonable at a distance and is now recalibrating up close. Eleanor met him in the front hall. She shook his hand. He looked at her with a professional assessment of encountering someone he has been told to work alongside, and she watched him make several rapid decisions about what he was going to do with the information he'd been given. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, "I've heard considerable things about you." "I imagine you have," she said pleasantly. "I hope they were accurate." "Marsh trained you," he said. No preamble. She appreciated that. "For 2 years formally, and I've continued independently." "You understand that what you're doing is technically outside the bounds of what my sex is permitted to do officially," she said. "Yes, I understand that completely." He looked at her steadily. "And you do it anyway. People were sick," she said. There was no one else. A pause. Something shifted in his expression, the recalibration completing itself. "Show me your records," he said. "On the Ford boy first." "Marsh always said he had an eye for methodology. I want to see yours." She showed him. He was quiet for a long time reading. She watched him read. His face gave very little away, but she had been watching faces give things away for 27 years. And what she saw was a man whose professional objections were running directly into his professional judgment and finding the second considerably stronger. "This is correct," he said finally, tapping the Ford notes. "The treatment is correct. Completely. Yes," she said. "I know." He looked up, that expression against surprise toward her, and then past surprise into something more complicated. "You have no doubt whatsoever about Thomas Ford?" She met his gaze. "I had doubt about several things in the beginning. I don't have it about this." "What changed?" "He slept 3 nights in a row," she said. "After March with no sleep." The doubt stopped seeming relevant. He was quiet for a moment. Then he did something she had not predicted. He sat down at the kitchen table, set his bag on the floor, and said, "Tell me what else you've seen." "All of it. From the beginning," she told him. He listened the way Nathaniel listened, with full attention, without filling her pauses with himself, without performing at her. He asked 3 questions, sharp and precise, and her answers were precise back at him. And by the end of the hour, something had been established between them that was not friendship, and was not exactly professional collegially in the traditional sense, but was something functional and real, and more useful than either. "I'll come every 2 weeks instead of once a month," he said, packing up. "The caseload warrants it." "Thank you," she said. He paused at the door. "Marsh always said you were the best student he'd had." He said it was a waste, what the profession wouldn't let you do. He picked up his bag. "I'm beginning to agree with him." He left. Eleanor stood in the kitchen and held very still for a moment, because she was not going to fall apart over a physician agreeing with her ability to practice medicine. She was absolutely not. She pressed her bare hand flat on the kitchen table and breathed until the tightness in her chest resolved itself into something manageable. Then she went upstairs and wrote everything down. 2 nights later, she and Nathaniel sat on the back porch of the manor in the July dark after supper, the first time they had sat together anywhere without the purpose of managing something, and the evening was so thick with cricket sound and the smell of warm grass that conversation felt both necessary and almost beside the point. "I heard what Beaumont said," Nathaniel said, before he left. "What did he say?" "He told me I was a fortunate man." Nathaniel paused. "I've been thinking about it, and I think he was right." He turned to look at her in the dark. "I think I have been. For some time now. I was simply the last to notice." Eleanor looked at him. In the dark his face was easier to read than in full light, the careful control of it less necessary, the actual Nathaniel Caldwell more present. "I was afraid of this," she said, "when I arrived." "Of what?" "Of wanting something I hadn't planned on." It seemed dangerous. "It is. You're not reassuring." "Would you prefer I was?" "No," she said. "Not particularly." He almost smiled. She felt it more than saw it. "Eleanor," he said. Her name, the way he said it, not addressed to her but used. like something he'd decided he was keeping. "I would like, if you're willing, to try to build something here. Not the safe version I had planned. Something that requires asking and answering and probably failing sometimes," and he stopped. Something real. She looked at him in the July dark, this man she had not expected, who had stood up at a dinner table not to rescue her but because he was proud of her, who had asked, "Are you all right?" and meant it, who had listened to the truth about his dead wife and chosen the true thing over the comfortable version. "Yes," she said, "I'm willing." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, the right one, the one with the most significant scarring, took it deliberately and held it. And she felt his thumb move once across the back of her hand in a gesture so quiet and so certain that it bypassed every defense she had spent 7 years constructing. She did not pull away. The night went on around them, the crickets, the warm dark, the smell of Virginia in July, the particular peace of a house that has begun, slowly and with effort, to become a home. She held his hand. She let herself want this. That, she thought, was probably the bravest thing she had done in 7 years. Braver than the fire. Braver than the Harrington dinner. Braver than any of it. She held on. The morning after Nathaniel held her hand in the July dark, Eleanor woke up with the particular clarity of someone who has made a decision they didn't know they were making until after they'd made it. She lay still for a moment, listening to the house breathe around her, the distant sounds of the kitchen starting up, Bessie's voice somewhere below, the horses moving in the stable yard. The sounds of a place that was alive. The sounds of a place that was, she understood now with a precision that surprised her, hers. Not because Nathaniel had given it to her. Not because she had married into it, or managed it well, or earned her way to the center of it through careful behavior. It was hers, because she had brought herself to it fully, without concealment, without the edited version of Eleanor Whitmore she had been offering the world for 7 years, and it had not broken under the weight of who she actually was. That was new. That was worth waking up clearly for. She dressed, buttoned her cuffs, and then stopped. Looked at her hands. Looked at the gloves in the drawer. Thought about Margaret's voice 3 weeks ago. "Take the gloves off when you're in this house." Thought about Nathaniel's thumb moving across the back of her scarred hand in the dark, certain and unhurried, and the way it had bypassed every defense she owned. She left the gloves in the drawer. She went downstairs. Bessie looked at her bare hands the moment she came to the kitchen and said nothing, which from Bessie was the loudest possible form of approval. Eleanor helped herself to coffee and stood at the kitchen table going over the week's schedule with the kind of focus she'd been applying to things since she was 12 years old and had learned that focus was the best available substitute for control. Dr. Beaumont on Wednesday, Mrs. Ford's Thomas on Thursday morning. 2 new women who had sent word through Ruth Jennings that they wanted to come. A letter to compose to Dr. Marsh in Richmond, who had written with questions she had not yet answered, because the answers were more complicated than she'd expected them to be. She was halfway through the schedule when Margaret came in, took one look at her hands, and said, "Good." Just the one word. Eleanor looked up and caught the expression on Margaret's face, not triumphant, not sentimental, just satisfied. The expression of someone watching something arrive at the place it was always supposed to be. "Good morning," Eleanor said. "He's already in the south field," Margaret said, pouring her own coffee. "He was gone before 5. He always is." He whistled, Margaret said. "Going out." "He hasn't whistled in 2 years." Eleanor set down her cup. "Margaret, I'm simply reporting what I observed," Margaret said, with a composure so deliberate it was almost humor. "It's relevant data." Eleanor looked at her for a moment and felt something warm move through her chest, something she didn't have a clean name for, the particular sweetness of being known by someone who had started out as a stranger and had decided, through the accumulated work of weeks, to know her anyway. "Your relevant data is noted," she said. Margaret almost smiled. Drank her coffee. The complication arrived, as complications tend to, on the day Eleanor had least capacity for it. She had been awake until past midnight with Mrs. Amelia Ford's younger child, the girl, barely 3, who had developed a fever faster than Thomas ever had, and whose breathing had done something alarming around 10 in the evening that brought her mother to the manor back door, with a lantern and a face white with terror. Eleanor had worked through the night. Nathaniel had sat in the kitchen, silent, available, not interfering, making coffee that nobody drank, replacing the water in the basin when she asked, staying present in the way of someone who understands that the most useful thing he can do is not leave. Margaret had sent him twice to check if there was anything more needed and then given up and come herself, and they had all 3 been in that kitchen until the small hours when the child's breathing steadied and the fever broke, and Mrs. Ford sat down in the chair by the stove and wept with the ugly, relieved completeness of a woman who has been terrified into honesty. Eleanor had gone to bed at 2 and risen at 6 because there was no help for it. So when Clara came to find her at 9:30 with a message that Mrs. Hartwell had arrived, not sent a note, not sent word ahead, but arrived, with Mrs. Cavendish and Louisa Harrington herself, Eleanor's first thought was, of course she has. Her second thought was, all right. She straightened her sleeves, did not reach for her gloves, went to the front parlor. They were arranged, the 3 of them, with the precision of women who have choreographed their entrance into a room with the same care other people apply to military formations. Mrs. Hartwell near the window, Louisa Harrington in the center, Mrs. Cavendish to the side, positioned for observation and comment. Mrs. Caldwell. Louisa Harrington spoke first. I hope we haven't come at an inconvenient time. Not at all, Eleanor said. She gestured toward the seating. Please, sit. They sat. Eleanor sat. She folded her hands in her lap, bare hands, visible, entirely deliberate, and waited. We've come, Louisa said, on a matter of some concern to several families in the county. Tell me, Eleanor said. Louisa looked at her hands. Then, with the careful control of a woman revising her approach mid-execution, there is a concern among several people that what you're doing here at the manor is overstepping. Overstepping what? Eleanor said. Your position, Mrs. Hartwell said. Smooth, immediate. She had been waiting for her entrance. You are the wife of a landowner, Mrs. Caldwell, not a physician. Not an official person of medicine in any recognized capacity. And yet you have been receiving women at this house, providing, she paused on the word with surgical precision, treatments. I have been answering questions, Eleanor said. And in some cases providing basic care where no physician was available. Dr. Beaumont has reviewed my records and approved my methods. He comes himself twice a month now, which he did not do before. Dr. Beaumont, Mrs. Hartwell said, has apparently found it convenient to expand his practice on the back of your arrangements. He's found it useful, Eleanor said, to the families who need him. That's rather the point. The point, Mrs. Hartwell said, her voice sharpening by one precise degree, is that women of uncertain background, coming and going from this house, discussing matters of a private nature is not. Uncertain background, Eleanor said quietly. The room went the way rooms go when something intended as a passing blow has landed somewhere more precise than planned. Eleanor looked at Mrs. Hartwell directly. My background, she said, is the daughter of a Virginia judge, trained by one of Richmond's most respected physicians, and documented in public record. If there is something uncertain about it, I would ask you to be specific. Silence. Or, Eleanor continued, her voice level and completely, unshakably even. If the concern is simply that I am doing something you did not expect a woman in my position to do, that is a different conversation, and I'm happy to have it. But I would ask that we have it honestly. Mrs. Hartwell's face did something complicated. She was not accustomed to being asked for honesty in this register, not by a woman she had decided on, not by someone she had already filed under manageable. Eleanor watched her recalibrate with the expression of someone who has arrived at a card game to find the other player has different cards than anticipated. Louisa Harrington spoke before Mrs. Hartwell could. "My daughter," Louisa said. Everyone in the room turned to look at her, including, Eleanor noted, Mrs. Hartwell, which meant Louisa had not consulted her before saying this. "My daughter," Louisa repeated, "has been ill since she was 14. The physicians I have taken her to have given me 3 different explanations and 2 conflicting treatments, and she has not improved in 4 years." She paused. "I came to you 2 weeks ago about this, Mrs. Caldwell. You gave me more useful information in 1 hour than 4 years of physician consultations." Eleanor held her gaze. "Yes," she said. "My concern," Louisa said, "is not that you are overstepping. My concern is that if this county decides to be small about what you're doing, I will lose access to the one person who has been genuinely useful to my daughter." She looked at Mrs. Hartwell, "which is why I suggested we come here today and have this conversation directly." The room had shifted. Completely. Eleanor could feel it, the particular irreversible tilt of a balance that has crossed its center point. Mrs. Hartwell was looking at Louisa Harrington with an expression that combined 30 years of friendship with the precise shock of someone who has discovered that the person they believed was their instrument is in fact playing their own tune. "Louisa," Mrs. Hartwell said. We agreed to discuss it," Louisa said crisply. "I've discussed it. With Mrs. Caldwell, twice, privately, and now, here." She turned back to Eleanor. "What would you need to continue what you're doing formally? With proper record-keeping and Dr. Beaumont's endorsement?" Eleanor looked at her steadily. Her mind was moving fast, very fast, through the implications of this moment, the door it was opening, the very specific and fragile nature of what was being offered and what could go wrong with it. "A dedicated room," she said, "not the kitchen. A proper space. Regular supply orders through Dr. Beaumont's practice, so there's a physician's name attached. And a record of every person I see, co-signed by Beaumont when possible." She paused. "That won't satisfy everyone, but it will give the county something official to point to, which is what people need when they want permission to accept something new." Louisa nodded once. "Then that is what we will arrange." Mrs. Hartwell stood up. She did it with the composure of a woman who has decided that departure is the only remaining dignified option, and she managed it well. She had been managing exits well for 50 years, and this one was no exception. "I can see," she said, "that my concerns are in the minority this morning." "Your concerns were heard," Eleanor said. "I don't dismiss them. The county's caution about new things is not unreasonable. I simply think that in this case, the evidence is stronger than the caution." Mrs. Hartwell looked at her for a long moment. And Eleanor held her gaze not with triumph, not with the satisfaction of having won, because she understood that the only victories worth having were the ones that left the other person somewhere they could stand, but with the same clear, present steadiness she had been holding since the first day as she arrived in this county. Something moved in Mrs. Hartwell's expression. Small. Quick. Gone before Eleanor could name it with certainty. "Good day, Mrs. Caldwell," she said. "Good day," Eleanor said. Mrs. Hartwell left. Mrs. Cavendish followed, slightly faster than dignity usually permitted. Louisa Harrington stood and held out her hand. Eleanor took it. "My daughter's name is Frances," Louisa said. "She is 18. I would like to bring her to you this week, if that is possible." "Thursday morning," Eleanor said. "I'll be here." Louisa nodded. And then, quietly, in a register so different from her public voice that it was like hearing a different person, "I'm sorry it took me this long." "It took as long as it took," Eleanor said simply. "You're here now." Louisa left. Eleanor stood alone in the front parlor and let out one slow breath and then straightened her spine and went to find Nathaniel. He was back from the fields by noon. She intercepted him in the hallway, still in his work clothes, and told him everything quickly, efficiently, without editorializing, and watched his face move through several things in rapid succession. "Louisa Harrington came here," he said, and told Mrs. Hartwell, in front of you, that she disagreed with her. "Yes, Louisa Harrington. He said it again, as though the name needed repeating. Who has not disagreed with Catherine Hartwell in 30 years, publicly or otherwise? Her daughter needed help, Eleanor said. It focuses people. He looked at her for a long moment. A dedicated room, he said. You mentioned the East sitting room, the one that hasn't been used since he stopped. Since Catherine, she said, yes, if that's agreeable. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him make the decision, not the practical calculation of it, which she knew he'd completed in 30 seconds, but the other part. The part that involved a room that had held a version of his life that was over. The decision to let it become something new. It's agreeable, he said. More than agreeable. He paused. I'll have it cleared this afternoon. You don't have to do it today. I know, he said. I want to. He went to change. Eleanor went to find Margaret and tell her, and Margaret, upon being told, sat down in the kitchen chair and pressed her hands flat on the table and looked at nothing for a full 30 seconds and then said, very quietly, good. That room should be used for something that matters. Bessie, from the stove, said, somebody better tell Clara we'll need more chairs moved. And just like that, it became a practical problem, which was the best possible thing for it to become, because practical problems get solved, and in the solving of them, things become real. The twist that came next arrived not from outside the house but from inside it, and from a direction Eleanor had genuinely not seen coming. It was Margaret who found it. Margaret, who had been going through the remainder of Catherine's correspondence with the systematic, gentle thoroughness of a woman honoring her dead sister-in-law by finally seeing her clearly, all of her, not just the beautiful surface found. Tucked into the back of the same trunk as the Philadelphia letters, a smaller packet tied with ribbon. She brought it to Eleanor on a Wednesday evening, set it on the desk between them. Looked at it. These aren't from Catherine, Margaret said. They're from before Nathaniel married her. They're addressed to him. Eleanor looked at the packet, looked at Margaret. You haven't opened them. No, Margaret's voice was careful, but I could see the handwriting on the outside. And I recognized it. It's a woman's handwriting. Not Catherine's. A silence. You think someone should tell him, Eleanor said. I think he deserves to know what's in his own house. Margaret looked at her steadily. And I think it should come from you. Eleanor looked at the packet for a long moment. Why me? Because Margaret said he trusts you in a way he doesn't trust me anymore. Not less than before, differently. He used to trust me to manage things. He trusts you to tell him the truth. She pushed the packet slightly toward Eleanor. There's a difference. Eleanor picked up the packet. She went to the study. Nathaniel was at his desk. He looked up when she came in, and he read her face the way he'd learned to read it quickly, accurately, without waiting for her to arrange herself. Sit down, he said immediately. She sat. She set the packet on the desk between them. Margaret found these in the East trunk room, she said. She didn't open them. She recognized the handwriting on the outside, not Catherine's, and she thought you should know they existed. He looked at the packet. He did not reach for it immediately. She watched him understand, before he opened anything, that whatever this was, it was going to require the same quality of attention he had given Catherine's letters, the willingness to receive the true thing rather than the comfortable version. He picked up the packet, untied the ribbon, opened the first letter. Eleanor watched his face while he read. She did not look at the letters themselves, they were not hers to see unless he chose to show her, but she watched his face, the way it moved through several things she could only partially name. Surprise. Something older than surprise, recognition. He read all of them. It took perhaps 10 minutes. When he was done, he set them on the desk and sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of a man who is doing the arithmetic of his own history and finding the sums unexpected. Before Catherine, he said. Before all of it, he paused. A woman I considered. He stopped. Her family objected. The arrangement was it was ended before it could begin. "Did you love her?" Eleanor asked, quietly. Not jealously, she was past jealousy, or perhaps had never quite arrived at it. "Just asking." "I thought so," he said. "I was 28. I thought what I felt at 28 was the whole territory." He looked at the letters. "I married Catherine 18 months later. She was everything anyone could have asked for. And I put those 18 months in a drawer and left them there." "And now you've found them," Eleanor said. "Now I found them." He looked at her. "I'm telling you this because you should know it. Because I told you I wanted to build something real and real things require." He stopped. "I'm not telling you this to explain myself. I'm telling you because you deserve the whole of who you're married to. Not the arranged version." Eleanor looked at him across the desk. At the letters. At the man who had found the true thing and chosen it again. Just now. In real time. Without being asked. "Tell me," she said. He told her. It took a long time. The study grew dark around them, and neither of them moved to light another lamp, and the July evening pressed warm against the windows, and Nathaniel Caldwell told his wife the unedited story of himself the woman before. The marriage arranged in the aftermath of grief that was not Catherine's fault, and not his fault exactly, but had been a kind of escape they had both dressed up as practicality. The years of doing his duty faithfully, and not understanding why duty felt so much like emptiness. The loss of Catherine and the guilt of not being certain what specifically he was grieving. The long 2 years of waiting, without knowing what he was waiting for. And Eleanor listened. Completely. Without filling his pauses. Without organizing it, or interpreting it, or telling him what it meant. She simply held the room while he spoke and let him be heard by someone who had decided, sometime in the last few weeks and possibly on a back porch in the July dark, that she was going to know this man. All of him. The parts that fit her idea of him and the parts that didn't. When he finished, they sat in the dark study for a while. "Eleanor," he said. The way he always said it, her name kept. "Yes, I am not the man I should have been," he said. To Catherine. To before. I made choices that were safer than they were honest, and I called them practical, and I am not. He stopped. "I'm not asking you to tell me it's all right." "Good," she said. "Because it isn't entirely. But it's true. And true is what we can work with." He looked at her. The particular look, not the measuring one from the beginning, not the one still trying to read the language. This was something settled. Something that had arrived. "Yes," he said. "It is. Come to supper," she said. "Bessie's made something and she'll be offended if it gets cold." He stood. He came around the desk and stopped in front of her, and she looked up at him in the dark of the study, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and then he lifted his hand and touched her face, cheek, one brief, careful touch. The back of his fingers against her jaw, deliberate the way all his gestures were, not tentative but considered, and she leaned into it for exactly the time it lasted, which was not long but was enough. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. They went to supper. August arrived. The heat broke slightly, the way Virginia heat sometimes does in the second week of the month not gone, but negotiated, the mornings turning briefly cool before the sun burned through. The east sitting room had become, by the third week of August, a place Eleanor thought of the way she thought of her own hands, simply part of herself, present and functional and unastonishing in its ordinariness. Dr. Beaumont's name was on the records. The supply orders went through his practice. 6 women had come in the first 2 weeks, 12 in the third. Louisa Harrington had brought Frances on the Thursday as promised. And Eleanor had spent 2 hours with the girl and come away with both a preliminary understanding of what was happening in Frances Harrington's body and the clear conviction that Frances Harrington was considerably more capable and intelligent than anyone in her life had yet noticed, which she intended to address. Thomas Ford came for what Eleanor told Mrs. Ford would be his last formal visit. He was well, genuinely, completely, thriving in the August morning well, and when Eleanor crouched down to his level and asked him how he was sleeping, he said every night now. Ma'am, with the matter-of-fact confidence of a 7-year-old who has forgotten that sleeping every night was ever remarkable. She watched them walk back down the lane and felt something so simple and complete it barely needed a name. Margaret found her there, standing in the doorway watching the Fords go. 2 more letters came this morning, Margaret said. Women from the North County. They've heard from Mrs. Dunmore. She paused. Mrs. Hartwell's housekeeper also sent a note. Anonymous. Asking if a woman could come without giving her employer's name. Eleanor turned. She worded it very carefully. A pause. I think Mrs. Hartwell may have a condition she hasn't discussed with anyone. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Thought of Mrs. Hartwell's face in the parlor 3 weeks ago, the complicated thing that had moved across it when Eleanor held her gaze. The thing she hadn't been able to name. Right back, Eleanor said. Tell her anyone who comes here comes in confidence. No names leave this house without permission. Margaret nodded. Then she won't stop being who she is, you know, even if she comes. I know, Eleanor said. I'm not asking her to. Margaret looked at her steadily. You're a better person than I am. You'd have done the same thing, Eleanor said. I'd have thought about it longer, Margaret said, and turned back inside. Eleanor stood in the doorway a moment longer. The August morning was cooling slightly at the edges, the trees beginning their slow turn toward the promise of fall, the whole of the Caldwell estate going about its business in the sun. Ruth Jennings's cottage, just visible through the pines. The lane where Mrs. Ford and Thomas had disappeared. The kitchen garden, where the beans were finishing their season. This place, this particular, specific, irreplaceable place that she had arrived at 6 weeks ago in gloves and calculated composure and a careful, private terror, ready to manage a practical arrangement and survive it. She had survived it. That was not quite what she meant. She had done something different from surviving, something she had spent so long not doing that she had almost forgotten it was possible. She heard him behind her before she heard his steps had learned his presence, the way you learn the sounds of a house, by frequency and repetition, until they settle into something below conscious thought. The North County women, Nathaniel said. Margaret told me. News travels fast in this house. Always has. He came to stand beside her in the doorway. I've been thinking about the spring. What about it? The room works for now. But spring means more families, more cases. Beaumont can't come every 2 weeks indefinitely. He paused. I've written to the medical college in Philadelphia. There's a discussion happening about formally training women. It's early. Nothing official, but I have a contact there. Eleanor turned to look at him. I thought, he said, carefully, watching her face, that if there were ever a case to be made for a woman with existing training, existing records, existing practice, documented results. Nathaniel. Her voice came out differently than she intended. He stopped. Too much, he said. No, she said, not too much. She looked at him for a long moment. You wrote to Philadelphia. Last week, he said. I should have told you before I did it. I wasn't sure it was real enough to mention until I heard back. And they want to correspond further. He held her gaze. Nothing is certain. Nothing is soon. But they want to correspond. Eleanor stood in the doorway of her house in the August morning, with her bare hands at her sides, and thought about the girl she had been at 12, watching her mother die of something treatable. Thought about the woman she had been at 20, learning medicine in Dr. Marsh's office, already knowing she would never officially be what she was in practice. Thought about 7 years of gloves and careful management and the practiced art of being less than she was in rooms that required it. She thought about Nathaniel last week, sitting down at his desk and writing a letter on her behalf to a medical college in Philadelphia. Without being asked, without telling her. Not extio her, she did not need rescuing, but because he had been paying attention, the way she had always been paying attention to everyone else, and had decided that what he saw deserved more room than the world currently offered it. She pressed her hand flat against the doorframe, felt the wood solid and warm from the morning sun. "Thank you," she said. It was the second time she had said it to him with that specific weight behind it. Both times she had meant it as completely as language allows. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "It may come to nothing." "It may," she said. "But you wrote the letter." He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "I did." She took his hand. Just that took it, the way he had taken hers on the porch. Deliberate and unhurried, the right hand, the scarred one, the one that had gone into a burning building and come out changed forever. He held it. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me." "I arrived here afraid," she said, "not of you. Of this. Of wanting something I hadn't planned. Of letting anything matter enough to lose." She paused. "I spent 7 years deciding that the safest way to live was to manage everything from a certain distance." "I know," he said quietly. "I'm not doing that anymore," she said. "I want you to know that. I'm not doing it anymore." He was very, she said, simply. Directly. The way she had always said the important things, without dressing them up, without protecting herself from the size of them. "I don't know exactly when it happened. Somewhere between the kitchen table and the gate and the Harrington dinner and last week on the porch. But it has happened, and I am not afraid of it." He looked at her for what felt like a long time. His hand held hers tightly. "Eleanor," he said. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since you walked into the tenant cottage and pushed your sleeves up and knelt beside that child's bed without a moment of hesitation." He paused. "I didn't know what to do with it then. I know now." She looked at him, full and clear and entirely without the careful management of distance. "What do you do with it?" she said. "This," he said. And he pulled her in, and he kissed her, not tentatively, not as a question, but as a statement. As a thing decided and meant. And Eleanor let herself be kissed by her husband in the doorway of their house in the August morning, her scarred hands against his chest, and the whole estate going about its business around them. And she felt the last carefully maintained distance inside her, close like a door that no longer needed to stand open. The county decided, over the course of September and October, what it thought of Eleanor Caldwell. It decided not unanimously, not without complication, not without misses. Hartwell's continuing objections from certain corners that it was glad she was there. Frances Harrington had improved significantly under Eleanor's care, and Louisa Harrington was not a woman who kept that kind of gratitude private. Thomas Ford's recovery had become something of a local legend, in the way that recovery stories become local legends retold, slightly enlarged and deeply felt. Dr. Beaumont told his colleagues in Charlottesville that the Caldwell estate had the best documented rural medical records in the county, possibly in the region, and that the woman running the East Sitting Room practice was the most naturally gifted diagnostician he had encountered in 20 years. Mrs. Hartwell's housekeeper came on a Thursday in September. She gave no name. Eleanor asked for none. She stayed for an hour and left with a treatment for something she had been managing alone for 3 years. She came back the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that. She never mentioned her employer. Eleanor never asked. Some doors, she had learned, open slowly, and the only way to honor that is to be standing on the other side, patient and present and ready, when they finally do. By October, a second letter had come from the Philadelphia Medical College. More specific than the first, more hopeful. Nathaniel read it with Eleanor at the study desk and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "We should go in the spring." "In person. I think in person is stronger." "You'd come," she said. "Of course I'd come." He looked at her with a slight expression of bewilderment at the question. "You'd go without me?" "I'd manage," she said. "I know you would," he said. "I didn't ask whether you'd manage. I asked whether I could come." She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "you can come." He nodded, went back to the letter. She looked at his profile in the study lamplight and thought, this is what it looks like. This is what it looks like when someone sees you, not the version you offer, not the version they want, but you, specifically. With your scarred hands and your medical kit and your stubbornness and your capacity to stand in a room full of people who want you to flinch, and simply, steadily, not flinch. This is what it looks like when that person decides to stay. In the last week of October, Eleanor stood in the east sitting room after the last woman of the day had gone and looked at the record book on the desk. 43 names. 43 women who had come through that door. 43 conversations that had given someone language for something they had only had silence for before. Margaret came to stand beside her. 43, Margaret said. In 4 months. What do you think the spring brings? Eleanor looked at the book. More, she said. Margaret nodded. Good. She paused. I've been corresponding with a woman in Richmond. A friend of Dr. Marsh's. She wants to know how we organized it. She has a group of women in Richmond asking similar questions. Eleanor turned to look at her. You've been corresponding with her. For 3 weeks. Margaret met her gaze with a composure that was entirely too innocent. I thought it relevant. Margaret. Yes, you are, Eleanor said, remarkable. Something moved across Margaret Caldwell's face, the thing that had been growing there for months, slowly and with effort. The particular look of a woman who is beginning to believe what other people have been telling her about herself. I had a good example, she said. She went out. Eleanor stood alone in the room that had been a closed door and was now 43 names in a record book and letters to Richmond, and a correspondence with Philadelphia, and a Tuesday morning, when Nathaniel would read a letter at the desk and say we should go in person. She picked up the record book, held it for a moment. Then she set it down, walked to the window, and looked out at the October estate, the fields going gold and amber, the oaks along the drive beginning their long exhale into autumn, the whole of Caldwell Manor going about its life. Full and complex and completely irreversibly, entirely her own. She had come here in gloves. She had come here afraid of wanting. She had come here ready to manage a practical arrangement and survive it and call that enough. She stood at the window of her home with her bare hands and her name in 43 women's record books, and then the sound of her husband's boots on the stairs and the knowledge certain and settled and running all the way. Down to bone that she was not surviving anything. She was living. Fully, finally, without apology and without distance, she was living. And that was something no one, not Mrs. Hartwell, not society, not 7 years of careful management, not any of it, would ever take from her again.